He didn't even let her finish stepping off the train. Thomas Brennan took one look at the small girl clutching Elena Whitmore's hand, eyes unfocused, head tilted slightly, the way blind children hold themselves when they're reading the world through their feet and fingertips. And his face closed like a door being slammed shut. He didn't whisper it. He didn't pull Elena aside. He said it right there on the platform, loud enough for every soul in Timber Ridge to hear, "You didn't tell me she was defective." Elena's breath stopped. Around them, a dozen people went still. Miners with their lunch pails, women with their shopping baskets, the station master with his clipboard frozen halfway to his chest. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. And Grace, 8 years old and unable to see a single face in that crowd, reached up and found her mother's wrist with both hands and held on. That was the moment. Right there. Not in any courtroom, not in any letter, not in any of the 100 small humiliations that had come before. That was the moment Elena Whitmore understood that she had walked her daughter into the worst mistake of her life. Before we go further, if you've ever been told you were too much or not enough, or that the people you love make you a burden, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow Elena and Grace all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because it's going somewhere you won't expect. The letter had come in February, when the cold in Pittsburgh was the kind that gets inside your walls. Elena had been sitting at the kitchen table after Grace fell asleep, reading it for the third time by the light of a candle that was almost gone. Thomas Brennan, mine foreman in a place called Timber Ridge, Colorado. 41 years old, widower. No children. He'd gotten her name from a placement service in Philadelphia, the kind that matched women of good character and modest means, with men in the Western territories who needed wives. The letter was written in a careful, deliberate hand, the kind of penmanship that suggested a man who took his time with things. "I am not a man of flowery speech," he'd written, "but I can promise you a clean home, a steady income, and a life without want. I understand you have a daughter. Children are a blessing, and I would expect to provide for her as my own." She had read that sentence 4 times. I would expect to provide for her as my own. She had been foolish enough to believe it. The months before the letter had been the hardest of her life, and that was saying something, because the years before that hadn't been easy either. Elena had married at 19. Henry Whitmore, a machinist from Ohio who came to Pittsburgh for work and stayed for her. He was a good man, Henry. Not perfect, God knows. He drank more than he should have when the work dried up, and his temper could turn sharp on a tired evening, and there were things he promised that he didn't deliver. But he loved Elena in the way that men of that generation loved, quietly, practically, and with his whole chest when the moment called for it. Grace had been born 2 years into the marriage, and the blindness showed itself in the first weeks. The doctor in Pittsburgh had a clinical word for it, some Latin phrase that meant nothing to either of them. What it meant in plain language was this: their daughter would never see. Henry had gone very quiet when the doctor said it. On the walk home, he'd held Elena's hand so hard her fingers ached, and neither of them spoke until they were back inside with the door shut. "She's still our girl," Henry said finally. "Yes," Elena said. "She is." That was all. They didn't make speeches about it. They adjusted. That was what people like them did. Not with grace, not without grief, but with the kind of stubborn momentum that comes from having no other option. Elena learned to describe things to Grace in fine detail. Not just there's a bird, but there's a small bird, round like a fist, gray on top and pale underneath, and it's sitting on the left side of the windowsill, hopping back and forth like it can't decide. Henry built a rope line in the backyard so Grace could find her way from the house to the garden on her own. Grace, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by what she couldn't do. She was interested in everything. She asked questions that made Elena's head hurt. Then Henry died. Pneumonia, the winter Grace turned 5. Fast and brutal. 3 weeks from the first cough to the end. Elena had sat beside him while he went and held his hand all the way through. And then she had stood up and walked into the kitchen and stood at the sink for a long time with the water running cold over her wrists, staring at the drain. She had a blind 5-year-old and $12 and a landlord who had been patient for exactly as long as a landlord can be patient before it stops being patience and starts being stupid business. The next 3 years were the years she didn't like to think about. She'd taken in sewing, not the elegant kind, not the kind that requires formal training, the grunt work of it, hemming and patching and letting out seams for men who'd put on weight and women who'd lost it. She was good with her hands. She'd always been good with her hands. Her mother had taught her to sew before she could read, and the skill had stayed in her fingers even when the rest of her life fell apart. She worked through the evenings after Grace was asleep, straining her eyes in bad light, and the money was never enough, but it was something. Grace went to a school for blind children run by a charitable organization on the north side of the city. Elena walked her there every morning, an hour each way, and picked her up every afternoon. The school was underfunded and overcrowded, and the teachers were stretched thin, but there was one woman there, a Miss Adler, who had seen something in Grace that Elena had been seeing for years and had never been able to name. Grace had an extraordinary memory. Not just good, extraordinary. She could hear a piece of music once and reproduce it on the piano from memory. She could follow a conversation she was only half listening to and repeat it back word for word an hour later. She understood spatial arrangements through touch alone. Hand her an unfamiliar room and 5 minutes later she could navigate it in the dark. "She's going to need more than we can give her here," Miss Adler told Elena one afternoon quietly, while Grace was in the other room. "I don't say that to discourage you. I say it because she's too much for this place. She needs room." Elena hadn't known what to do with that. Room cost money. Room required stability. Room was the one thing she didn't have. And then the letter came. She had stared at that line. "I would expect to provide for her as my own." And she had thought, this is not something a bad man writes. This is not how a man who means to be cruel puts it. This is a man who has thought about it and made a decision and is telling her plainly what that decision is. She wrote back. She told him about Grace, not in a way that was defensive or apologetic, but plainly the way she'd learned to tell people things because in her experience, dancing around the truth only postponed the problem. "My daughter Grace is 8 years old and she has been blind since birth. She is not helpless. She is not a burden. She is one of the most capable people I have ever known. And I say that with full understanding of how a mother sounds when she says such a thing. But I want you to know the truth before you make any decision so that we are both clear." She'd mailed it on a Tuesday and spent the next week in a state of cold, functional dread, getting through each day and waiting for the refusal. His reply came in a week and a half. "Your honesty is appreciated. My offer stands." 4 words. But 4 words that had changed everything. She'd given notice at her rooming house, packed what she could carry, and bought 2 train tickets to Colorado. Grace had been thrilled. The child had never been on a long train ride before, and she'd spent the journey with her face turned toward the window, feeling the changing pressure of light on her skin, listening to the shift in sounds as they moved through cities, and then through plains, and then into the mountain country. "It smells different here," Grace said as they crossed into Colorado. She said it with authority, not wonder. The way she always announced things she'd figured out, like facts she was presenting for confirmation. "Mountains," Elena said. "The air is thinner," Grace said, "and drier. And there's something else, something like cold pine needles." Elena had looked at her daughter's profile, that serious small face, and felt the thing she always felt when Grace did this. A fierce, aching love tangled up with something that was almost pride and almost fear at the same time. She deserves more than I can give her, Elena thought. She deserves everything. That thought had still been in her head when the train pulled into Timber Ridge. The platform at Timber Ridge was rougher than she'd imagined. The town sat in a narrow valley between 2 steep ridgelines, and everything about it felt compressed. The buildings close together, the sky above narrowed to a strip, the mountains crowding in from both sides like they were minding their own business, but couldn't quite help looming. The late April air had a bite to it, and the light had a particular clarity that made everything look slightly more itself than usual, which was either beautiful or unsettling depending on your mood. Thomas Brennan was easy to find because he was standing at the edge of the platform with his arms crossed and the expression of a man conducting an inspection. He was bigger than Elena had expected, wide through the chest, heavy-browed, with a foreman's permanent squint from years of reading conditions in dangerous underground spaces. He wore his good clothes, which told her he'd made an effort, and his hair was slicked back in a way that suggested he'd thought about this meeting more than he'd intended anyone to know. Elena descended the train steps with her traveling case in one hand and Grace's hand in the other. Grace's small fingers were wrapped around two of hers, the child moving with that careful, earth-reading confidence she always had. Weight slightly forward, free hand loose at her side, head tipped just a degree to the left to catch sound directionally. She was 8 years old, and she navigated better than most adults Elena knew. Brennan's face changed in the first second. She saw it happen, not dramatically, not in a single flash, but in layers, like watching a man close a series of doors inside himself. His eyes went to Grace, stayed there, then came back to Elena with something new in them that had not been there before. He didn't say hello. He didn't come forward. He stood exactly where he was and said, in a voice that carried clearly across the 20 feet between them, "What's wrong with her eyes?" Elena stopped walking. She heard Grace's breath catch, just barely, just the smallest intake, and felt the child's grip tighten. "She's blind," Elena said, "as I told you in my letter." "You told me she had difficulty with her sight." His voice was flat. Not angry yet, just flat in the way that flat voices can be worse than angry ones. "You did not tell me she was—" He looked at Grace again. Whatever he was going to say, he chose something else. "You did not tell me the extent of it." "I told you she has been blind since birth," Elena said. Her voice was very steady. She had learned to keep her voice steady when she was most frightened. It was a trick that had served her and cost her in equal measure. "Those are direct words. I don't know how to be more direct than that." Around them, the platform had gone quiet in the way that public spaces go quiet when something private becomes public against its will. The station master, a woman with a covered basket, two minors in work clothes waiting for the next arrival. All of them not quite looking, not quite not looking. "She can't work," Brennan said. "She's 8. When she's grown, she can't work, she can't contribute, she can't—" He stopped. He was having trouble, she could see, finding words that were honest without being unacceptable even by his own standards, and the struggle was making him angrier. "I needed a wife who could run a household, Mrs. Whitmore. Not a nursemaid situation. I didn't sign up to take on a—" And then he said it. The word that she'd been afraid he was building toward. The word that the letter had made her believe he was too decent to use. A defective child. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The before silence had been the quiet of people pretending not to listen. The after silence was the quiet of people who had heard something they couldn't unhear and didn't know what to do with it. Grace's fingers had gone completely still inside Elena's hand. Not tightened, not trembling, still. The way Grace went still when she was processing something from the outside world into the inside language only she fully understood. Elena looked at Thomas Brennan for a moment. She was aware of everything in that moment with a strange sharpness. The cold in the air, the smell of coal smoke, the sound of someone's horse shifting its weight on the other side of the building, the specific quality of the afternoon light on the mountains behind him. She was aware that she had $2.40 in the pocket of her traveling coat. She was aware that she had nowhere to go. She was aware that every person on that platform was watching her, and that whatever she did in the next 10 seconds would be the first thing anyone in Timber Ridge ever knew about her. She looked down at Grace. Grace was looking up. Not at Brennan. She couldn't have picked him out of the space in front of her. She was looking up in the direction of her mother's face, and her expression was the expression Elena had seen on it 100 times. That focused, inward attention, like the child was taking a reading off something the rest of the world couldn't measure. "Mama," Grace said quietly. "Yes, love." His voice sounds like someone who is afraid of things he doesn't understand. It was said the way Grace said most things, matter of fact, without cruelty and without performance, just the straightforward application of information to conclusion. It was not loud enough to carry far. But the station master heard it. The woman with the basket heard it. Elena heard it, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, not courage exactly, but something older and more necessary than either of those. She looked back at Thomas Brennan. "I believe," she said, "that we have made a mistake, both of us." "I didn't make a mistake," he said. "You misrepresented your situation. I wrote you a letter telling you my daughter had been blind since birth. If you chose to interpret that as something other than what it said, that is a failure of reading, not of writing." She picked up her traveling case. "I won't trouble you further." "You have nowhere to go," he said. He said it as a fact, not a threat, but the distance between those two things was very thin, and he knew it. That's true, Elena said, but I've had nowhere to go before. She walked off the platform with Grace's hand in hers. She didn't know where she was going. She walked because walking was what you did when standing still wasn't an option, and because she would rather face whatever came next in motion than stand there and let Thomas Brennan watch her realize how bad her situation was. Behind her, she heard someone, a woman's voice, low and private, say, "Lord have mercy." Grace's hand was steady in hers. Her daughter was walking the way she always walked in unfamiliar places, carefully and without panic, one foot testing each step before committing her weight. "He didn't read your letter properly," Grace said, after they'd gone half a block. "No. That was careless." "Yes. What are we going to do?" Elena looked at the street ahead of them, the mud-churned main road of Timber Ridge, the wooden storefronts, the mountain air so cold and clean it almost hurt to breathe. She had $2.40. She had a traveling case with 2 dresses, a change of clothes for Grace, her sewing kit, and Henry's pocket watch, which she'd kept because it was the only thing of his she'd been able to bring. "We're going to find somewhere to sit down," she said, "and then we're going to figure out the next thing." "Not all the things." "No, just the next one." Grace nodded. This was a system they had developed over years of necessity. Don't try to solve everything at once. Find the next thing. Do that. Then find the one after. It was a humble philosophy. It was also the one that had kept them alive. The boarding house was run by a woman named Marta Voss, German-born and 40 years in the territory, with a face that had been weathered into something both hard and oddly gentle, the way good leather gets after long use. She came to the door of her establishment on the east end of Main Street, looked at Elena, looked at Grace, and looked at the traveling case. "You just came in on the afternoon train," she said. "Yes." "You were supposed to marry Thomas Brennan." Word traveled fast in small towns. Elena had forgotten that. Or maybe she'd known it and refused to think about it because she'd expected to arrive as a bride, not a cautionary tale. "That arrangement did not work out," Elena said. Marta Voss looked at them for another moment. There was an assessment happening behind her eyes that was neither kind nor unkind, just the practical calculation of a woman who ran a business and couldn't afford sentimentality but had not yet excised it completely from her character. "I have one room," she said finally. "It's small, up at the top. You'll share a washroom with the miners on the 3rd floor. $2 a week, meals not included." "I have $2.40, Elena said, "and I can sew. I've been doing piecework for 3 years. If you have mending, yours, or for the men who board here, I can work toward rent." Marta looked at the case. "You have thread, needles?" "A full kit." "Carl in room 6 has had a split seam in his work coat for 2 months. If you fix that, and the tablecloth from the dining room that I tore last November, and the curtains in the front parlor that are coming apart at the heading, I'll give you a week for nothing, and we'll settle on arrangement after." It was not a generous offer. It was the offer of a woman who had a use for something and was willing to exchange what she had for what she needed, and not 1 cent more. Elena recognized this kind of transaction because it was the only kind she'd had access to for the past 3 years. "Agreed," she said. Grace turned her head toward Marta Voss. "You have a loose board at the 3rd step from the bottom of your stairs," she said. "It moves when weight goes onto the left side of it. You should have it nailed down before someone turns an ankle." Marta blinked. "I know about the board." "Just making sure," Grace said. Marta looked at Elena. Elena looked back. She had learned not to apologize for Grace. "Come in," Marta said. The room was as small as advertised. 2 narrow beds, a window that faced the mountain, a hook on the back of the door. The mattresses were thin and the blankets were rough wool, and there was a draft from around the window frame that Elena could feel from across the room. But it was a room. It had a door that locked and 2 walls that didn't move and a ceiling that kept out the sky. Grace ran her hands along the edges of everything, both beds, the windowsill, the door, the single chair in the corner. She was mapping. Elena watched her do this, as she had watched her do it in every new place they'd ever been, and felt the familiar tangle of emotions that she'd long since stopped trying to unknot. Love. Grief. Something fierce and protective. Something bone-tired. "The window faces west," Grace said. She said it the way she always announced things she'd worked out, like she was checking her own calculations. The warmth hits it in the afternoon. If it's sunny tomorrow, we'll want to keep the curtain open until about 3. I'll remember that, Elena said. She set the traveling case on the chair and sat on the edge of the nearer bed and put her hands on her knees and looked at the wall. The wall had a water stain on it in the rough shape of something she couldn't identify. Behind her, Grace sat down on the other bed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He was wrong about me, Grace said. Yes. He was also probably wrong about other things. Almost certainly. So we don't need him. No, Elena said. We don't need him. She said it with more conviction than she felt. But she'd found, over the years, that sometimes you said the necessary thing to your child, not because you fully believed it yet, but because you needed both of you to hear it said in a steady voice, and then you let the belief catch up with the words later. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm hungry. Elena almost laughed. I know. Let me talk to Mrs. Voss about the kitchen. And tomorrow? Tomorrow I'll start the mending, and then I'll see what else there is. The next thing, Grace said. The next thing, Elena agreed. Carl in room 6 was a man of about 50, with hands the size of coal shovels, and the particular brand of chronic awkwardness that some men develop when they've lived alone long enough that interacting with women requires visible effort. He brought the coat down to the parlor the next morning with the seam held together with a bent nail that he'd pressed through both sides as a temporary solution, and presented it to Elena with a look that suggested he expected her to tell him it was beyond saving. She turned it over in her hands. The split was along the left side seam, about 8 inches, with some stress fraying above it that would open further if not reinforced. The fabric was heavy canvas duck, worn but not thin, still serviceable if handled right. I can fix this, she said. I'll need to work a running back stitch through here first, then blanket stitch the edge. It'll hold better than it did before. Carl looked at her hands, then at the coat. How long? An hour. Maybe a little more. The fraying above the split needs attention, or it'll come undone again in a month. He gave a grudging nod. As he was turning to go, he said without quite looking at her, Heard about what happened at the station yesterday. I expect most people did. Brennan's He stopped. He was going to say something strong and then reconsidered, perhaps because he was in Marta's front parlor and there was a child present. He's not well liked, he finished, for what that's worth. It's not worth much right this moment, Elena said, but I appreciate you saying it. He nodded again and went back upstairs. Grace, sitting in the chair in the corner with her hands folded in her lap, said, He walks with his weight on the outside of his right foot. His left knee hurts. You can tell all that from his walk? And from the way his breathing changed when he shifted to climb the stairs. He rested weight differently on the first step versus the second. Elena looked at her daughter. That is very strange information to have. I don't choose what I notice, Grace said simply. She said it without apology and without pride, the way she said most things. It was a statement of fact. Elena had learned, slowly over 8 years, to receive these statements as facts rather than phenomena, to take what Grace observed and simply file it rather than marveling at it, because marveling made Grace self-conscious in a way she didn't fully understand but could clearly feel. The coat took an hour and 15 minutes. Elena did the running back stitch first, pulling the seam back into alignment with careful tension so it wouldn't pucker, then blanket stitched the raw edge in both directions from the split to reinforce against future stress. Then she went 2 inches above the frame and worked a fine diagonal tack stitch across 3 parallel lines. Marta came in while she was finishing and stood behind her for a moment watching. You're good, she said. I've had to be. Can you do finer work, blouses, collars, that kind of thing? Yes. The women in town, some of the mine managers' wives, they get things made in Denver and shipped out, and the shipping ruins them half the time. Seams come loose, lace gets torn. They pay well to have it fixed right. Elena looked up. Are you suggesting something? I'm suggesting you might have more work than one boarding house can give you, if you're interested. Marta's expression was still the practical one, still the calculation. But there was something else in it. Not kindness, exactly. Recognition, maybe. One survivor identifying another. Timber Ridge doesn't have a proper seamstress. Hasn't, since Mrs. Hauer left for Denver 3 years ago. I don't have equipment, Elena said. I have a kit. For a real workshop, I'd need a proper machine at minimum. Howard left some things in the building she rented. I happen to own that building. Marta paused. I would not charge rent for the first 2 months if you could see to repairs for me as part of arrangement. Elena watched her for a moment. Why are you doing this? Marta's face did something complicated. Because Thomas Brennan sent 2 other women back on the train before you. One of them had a sick mother with her. The other one, he said, was too old, and she was 37. She paused again. And because that child of yours told me about my staircase, and she was right. I nearly went down on it in November. It was not, Elena thought, the most sentimental offer she had ever received. It was a transaction, a woman with available assets meeting a woman with available skills, with a community grievance against a mutual antagonist providing the catalyst. But in her current situation, she could not afford to need charity to be more romantic than it was. I would like to see the space, she said. The building was 2 blocks off Main Street, narrow and longer than it looked from the front. The front room had good natural light from 2 street-facing windows, and Mrs. Howard had left behind a treadle machine that needed oil and a new needle, a large cutting table with a warped leg that could be shimmed, and a wall-mounted rack of thread in at least 40 colors. Grace stood in the middle of the front room and turned slowly, her free hand extended at her side. The floor is uneven in the far corner, she said, and there's a smell. Linseed oil from a long time ago. And something else. She tilted her head. Wood shavings. Elena looked at the floor. The far corner had a slight depression she hadn't noticed. The ceiling is lower toward the back, Grace continued. It changes the sound. And there's a window back there, probably a small one, because the air feels different. She walked toward the back room with the calm confidence of someone who had been told the layout in advance, feeling the floor with the balls of her feet before shifting her weight, one hand occasionally extending to verify a surface she'd anticipated. Elena and Marta followed her. She does this in every new place? Marta asked quietly. Always, Elena said. In the back room, Grace put her hand against the rear wall and stood still. This could be good, she said, to no one in particular. It could, Elena thought. It was a terrible situation, and it had terrible origins, and nothing about the next 6 months was going to be easy. But it could be good. She looked at Marta. When can I start? The first week was 12-hour days. She started with the Howard machine, which needed more than oil. The tension mechanism was stuck. The bobbin case had a crack that she found only by feel, and the needle was not just dull but bent, which meant every stitch it had taken in its final months of use had probably been subtly off. She cleaned it piece by piece, replaced what she couldn't repair with supplies from Timber Ridge's single general store, and had it running by Thursday. Word traveled, the way word traveled in mountain towns, which is to say faster than logic should allow. By the end of the first week, 3 women had appeared at the door with work. A split seam in a wool skirt, a collar that had come away from its bodice, and a dress that had been let out improperly by someone who didn't know what they were doing and now sat wrong through the shoulders. Elena took all 3, priced them fairly, and worked through 2 evenings. Grace was with her for most of it. She couldn't sew. The needle and thread required more visual precision than she had access to. But she organized. She sorted thread by texture and weight, developing a system of notches and knots she pressed into the ends of the wooden spools so she could identify them by touch. She arranged the cutting table so tools were always in the same place. She listened while Elena worked and asked questions with the same relentless curiosity she brought to everything. And by the end of the week, she could describe the difference between wool and cotton and linen through touch alone with more precision than most adult sewers Elena had known. "She's remarkable," said one of the women who'd come to pick up her skirt. She said it to Elena, but was watching Grace, who was at the thread rack running her fingers along the spools. "She is," Elena said. "I didn't mean any offense." "None taken," Elena said. She said it pleasantly and meant it only partially, because she had been fielding variations of "she's remarkable" for 8 years, and she knew that most of them were sincere and well-meaning, and still managed to carry inside them a faint trace of something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not condescension, but a species of surprise that Grace was remarkable, rather than just remarkable regardless of anything else. But she'd learned to let that go. You couldn't correct the entire world at once. The woman paid for the skirt, added a small extra. "For her," she said, nodding at Grace, and left. Grace turned from the thread rack. She left something extra. Yes. Because of me. Yes. Grace was quiet for a moment. That's complicated. It is, Elena agreed. I don't know if I like it. You don't have to decide yet. Grace thought about this. Then she turned back to the thread rack and went on with what she was doing. It was at the end of the second week that Elena first heard about Jacob Thorne. She heard about him the way she heard about most things in Timber Ridge, obliquely, through conversation that wasn't directed at her. She was working at the front table when Carl from the boarding house came in with his foreman's vest, which had a buttonhole that had finally given up after being forced over too large a button for too long. He was talking to another man, younger, a miner named Pete, with a raw-faced sunburn that suggested he worked above ground, and neither of them was paying particular attention to Elena's presence, which was the usual state of affairs when a woman was sitting quietly behind a workbench. Thorne was in town again, Pete said. Carl made a sound that was not quite interest and not quite dismissal. Trading pelts. Didn't talk to anybody, far as I saw. Just went to Harker's, did his business, and went back up. That's what he does, Carl said. You know that. Yeah, but Harker said he was... Pete stopped, seemed to reconsider. Harker said he looked thinner, like he hasn't been eating right. Man lives alone up in the mountain in February. He probably hasn't been eating right. People say he lost more of his hearing, that he can't hear anything now. Carl shrugged. This did not seem to change his assessment. Who is Jacob Thorne? Grace asked. Both men looked at her. They'd forgotten she was there, which happened more than people would have admitted. A man who lives up in the mountains, Carl said. After a moment, the way men of his generation had of deciding that explaining things to children was acceptable when the alternative was the child's curiosity continuing to exist in the air unanswered. He added, he was a trapper and a carpenter. Lost his hearing from an accident in the mines years ago. He doesn't come to town much. Why? Because people make it hard for him, Pete said. It came out more directly than he'd probably intended. He cleared his throat. When he tries to talk to people, sometimes they can't understand him. His speech has gotten... He paused again. He doesn't talk the same as before, since his hearing went. Grace turned this information over. Elena could see her doing it, the slight internal stillness that meant she was organizing something. That must be lonely, Grace said. Probably is, Carl said. He looked at his vest. Is it fixed? Elena handed it over. The buttonhole was reinforced with a fine silk thread that wouldn't tear again. After they'd gone, Grace sat quietly for a moment in her chair. I think, she said slowly, that a man who cannot hear might understand some things that other people don't. Elena looked at her daughter. What makes you say that? Because when you lose one way of knowing the world, you find other ways. She picked up a piece of fabric from the stack on the side table, scrap wool from a repair job, and ran her fingers along it in the particular way she had. I know that. He probably knows that too. Elena didn't answer. She went back to her work, but she thought about it later, in the room at the boarding house with Grace asleep in the other bed, the mountains dark outside the window, the cold coming through the draft around the frame. She thought about a man alone on a mountain with silence filling the space where sound used to be, finding new ways to understand the world. She thought, there are more people in this town who have been discarded than anyone admits. She thought, the next thing, just the next thing. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and pressed against the glass, and somewhere in the middle of town, a dog barked twice and was quiet, and Elena Whitmore pulled the rough wool blanket up around her shoulders and lay still in the dark, listening to her daughter breathe, and did not sleep for a long time. On the morning of her 16th day in Timber Ridge, she saw him. She was walking Grace to the mercantile to pick up a spool of linen thread she'd ordered, gray, medium weight, for a mending job that needed something between white and charcoal. When Grace stopped abruptly on the boardwalk outside Harker's trading post and turned her head. There's a man, Grace said. On your left. He's watching us. Elena looked. He was standing at the edge of the post porch, not quite on it and not quite off, one shoulder against the post, with a pack of rolled pelts leaning against the railing beside him. He was probably 40, perhaps a little past it, tall, lean in the way of men who spend long periods in conditions where eating enough is a secondary concern, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that had passed the point of deliberate decision and into the territory of simply existing. His clothes were heavy canvas and oilcloth, work-worn and functional, and his hands were wrapped around a tin cup of something from the post stove. He was looking at Grace, not in the way people usually looked at Grace, not with the particular quality of noticing that announced itself, and made her feel seen as a subject rather than a person. He was looking at her the way you look at something you recognize. When he noticed Elena looking back at him, he didn't look away. He just held it for a moment, and then he gave a small, deliberate nod. The kind that means, I see you. I'm not trying to make something of it. Is he the man from the mountain? Grace asked. She said it the way she always said things she'd concluded from available information, not a guess, a working hypothesis she was checking. Elena looked at him again. His hands were very still around the cup. I think he might be, she said. Grace turned her face forward again and started walking. He's not afraid of me, she said, as if confirming something she'd suspected. No, Elena said. He doesn't seem to be. She didn't look back as they walked on, but she was aware for the rest of that morning of something she hadn't felt since they'd stepped off the train in Timber Ridge. Some faint shift in the quality of the air, like a pressure change before weather turns. Not hope. She was too careful for hope, but something adjacent to it, something that hadn't been there before. The gray linen thread was the wrong weight. Elena didn't realize it until she was back at the workshop with Grace, unwinding the first yard and running it between her fingers. And by then the mercantile was closed for the midday hour, and she had a customer coming at 2 o'clock expecting the mended blouse to be finished. She stood at the cutting table and looked at the thread and thought several things she did not say out loud, because Grace was in the room. It's wrong, Grace said. Yes. The weight? It's heavier than what I ordered. Harker must have substituted when he ran out of the medium. She set it down. I can make it work if I adjust the tension on the machine, but it's going to pull differently at the needle, and I'll have to compensate every few stitches. That will slow you down. Yes. Grace sat down in her corner chair and folded her hands. You can do it, she said. Not as encouragement. Grace rarely offered encouragement in the conventional sense, the reassuring sounds that people made to smooth over difficulty. She said it as an assessment. She had watched Elena adapt to worse than wrong weight thread. Elena adjusted the tension mechanism, rethreaded the machine, and got to work. She was 40 minutes into the blouse when she heard the door. She expected a customer. What she got was Nora Finch, the wife of one of the mine supervisors, a woman about Elena's age with the particular bearing of someone who had been attractive at 20 and was now at 35, making peace with a different kind of authority, standing in the doorway holding a wool coat over one arm and wearing an expression that was trying to decide between apologetic and entitled, and had settled somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I heard you've been doing good work. I try to, Elena said. She kept her eyes on the machine. She had learned that stopping mid-seam was how you ended up with puckering. I have this coat. Nora came inside. She was doing the thing people did when they came into the workshop, looking around, taking it in, noting that it was better organized than they'd expected, noting that the child in the corner didn't react to their entry the way sighted children would. It needs the lining replaced. The original was silk, but the silk has torn, and I'd like something that wears better. Bring it to the table when I finish this seam, Elena said. Nora waited. Grace turned her head toward her. You're wearing rose water, Grace said, and you've been outside in the cold recently, the left side more than the right. Nora blinked. I walked from the east side of town. The wind was coming from the... She stopped. How did you know it was the left side? The cold is still in your coat on the left. You can hear it in how the fabric moves differently. Grace paused. Also, your left shoe has a thin spot on the heel. It makes a slightly different sound on the floorboards. Nora looked at Elena, who had finished her seam and was looking up now. She does that, Elena said. Does she do it on purpose? She notices things, Elena said. That's all. She stood and came to examine the coat. Let me see what we're dealing with. The lining was a pale gold silk that had deteriorated along the back panel and the left sleeve, where repeated friction had thinned it to the point of tearing. The coat itself was fine, heavy charcoal wool, well constructed, the kind of thing that lasted 20 years if you treated it right. I'd recommend a heavy cotton sateen for the replacement, Elena said. It breathes better than silk and wears better too. I have a cream weight that would work with the coat color. Nora looked at it. Not silk? Not unless you wanted to do this again in another few years. There was a pause while Nora weighed the preference for silk against the inconvenience of repetition. Fine, she said. Cotton. Elena named a price. Nora accepted it with the minor compression of lips that suggested she thought it slightly high, but recognized she had no real grounds for objection. There's one other thing, Nora said, as Elena was writing the order into the ledger she'd started keeping. She said it carefully, the way people said things they'd been turning over before arrival. I wanted to say, what happened at the station, with Brennan. She stopped. It wasn't right, what he did. Elena kept writing. No, it wasn't. He's not a cruel man normally. He's difficult. He has opinions about things that most people don't bother to have opinions about. But what he said about your daughter, in front of all those people, another pause. I was there. I had just come to the station to collect a parcel, and I didn't say anything. I should have said something. Elena looked up. Nora's face had the particular expression of someone delivering a confession they'd practiced but still found harder than expected. It was over very fast, Elena said. Yes, but... Nora didn't finish the sentence. She picked up her coat from the counter. I'll come back for it Thursday? Thursday afternoon. After she left, Grace said, she felt guilty. I know. She's been feeling it for 2 weeks. Probably. That's why she came here, not just for the coat. Elena looked at her daughter. Possibly. Do you forgive her? Elena thought about this with more seriousness than the question might have seemed to require, because Grace asked questions seriously and expected the same in return, and also because Elena didn't think forgiveness was something you could do cheaply without it meaning nothing. I don't know yet, she said. I think I need to see what she does next. Grace nodded. That satisfied her. She went back to sorting thread. The person who came back next was not Nora Finch. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into Elena's time in Timber Ridge, and she had just sent Grace across the street to Marta's boarding house for the midday meal, because the workshop had no kitchen, and Marta had extended the arrangement to include 1 meal a day for Grace as part of the informal patchwork of reciprocal obligations that Elena was slowly, carefully building. She was alone at the cutting table when she heard footsteps on the boardwalk outside, and then the door opened and there was a pause. Not the pause of indecision, but the pause of someone checking the space before committing to it. She looked up. Jacob Thorne was standing in the doorway. He was bigger than he'd seemed from across the street, or maybe the proportions of the workshop made him seem bigger, the narrowness of the room concentrating him. He had cleaned up since she'd seen him outside Harker's. The beard was trimmed, the canvas coat was brushed, the hair still needed cutting but had been pushed back. He was carrying something in his right hand, a wooden object, small, the size of a large book, and he held it with the careful grip of something he'd made himself and was used to handling. He looked at her. She looked at him. She'd already thought, in the 3 weeks since she'd seen him outside Harker's, about the fact that he couldn't hear. She'd thought about what that meant for any conversation they might have, and had arrived at no particularly useful conclusion except that she had a child who communicated in ways that most people didn't consider conversation, and that had not stopped her from being in almost constant conversation with that child for 8 years. She said, "Come in." He came in. He didn't sit down. He set the wooden object on the counter and turned it to face her. It was a small carved panel, rectangular, fitted into a simple frame. The carving was a mountain, not a romantic mountain, not a mountain from a painting, but the specific mountain that she could see from the workshop's back window when she looked up from the treadle machine. The particular shape of the near ridge with its outcropping on the right side that looked from a distance like a crooked shoulder. It was worked in careful detail. The grain of the wood used to suggest rock texture. The flat areas of pine stands rendered with grouped shallow cuts that somehow looked like trees without being picture book trees. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. He was watching her face the way people who can't hear learn to watch faces. Not casually, not generally, but with the focused attention of someone for whom the information that most people get through sound is arriving entirely through other channels. She reached for the ledger she kept at the counter and turned it to a blank page. She wrote, "This is beautiful work." He read it. His expression didn't change much. There was a slight shift around the eyes, something that acknowledged what she'd written without performing a reaction to it. He reached for the pencil she left beside the ledger and wrote under her words, slowly, "I heard you came. I wanted to see what you built." She looked up. What I built was an interesting way to put it. She thought about the workshop, the treadle machine that she'd oiled back to life, the cutting table with its shimmied leg, the thread rack reorganized by Grace, the mended tablecloth from Marta's dining room still faintly visible in the weave where the tear had been. She wrote, "It's just a start." He read that and almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved. He wrote, "Starts are enough." She looked at him properly then, not the quick professional glance of assessing a new customer, but actually looked. His hands were remarkable. She noticed hands the way sewing people did, because hands were the medium everything passed through, and his had the quality she associated with people who were genuinely skilled with them. The small, controlled movements, the absence of waste. The carving said the same thing the hand said. She wrote, "My daughter wants to meet you." Then she looked at what she'd written and added, "I'm not sure why I wrote that first. My name is Elena Whitmore." He read both. This time, the smile made it further. Half his mouth. Nothing performed about it. He wrote, "I know who you are. I'm Jacob Thorne." Then, after a pause, he added, "Tell me about your daughter." Elena set down the pencil. She considered this request. Most people didn't ask to be told about Grace. They either reacted to Grace directly, or they asked careful questions that were really about the blindness rather than about Grace, or they made the mistake of speaking around her as though she weren't present. Nobody had ever simply asked her to tell them. She picked up the pencil. "Where did you start with Grace?" She started the way she'd start describing anything important, with the essential thing, the one that arranged everything else around it. She wrote, "She pays attention to everything. She has better information about most situations than the people who can see them." Jacob read this and looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, but recognized as something like, not surprise, but the quality of being accurately described. He wrote, "Sounds familiar." What? Grace came back from Marta's 40 minutes later, and Elena heard the particular pattern of her footsteps on the boardwalk, the careful initial step onto the new surface, the brief pause, then the confident stride of someone who had the layout memorized. And then the door opened and Grace walked in and turned her head and stopped. "There's someone here," she said. "Yes," Elena said. "His name is Jacob Thorne." Grace was still for a moment. She was reading the room the way she always read rooms. Air pressure, sound, the faint shifts that most people's sensory apparatus didn't bother processing. Her face went through several small calculations. "He's standing on the left side of the counter," she said. "He's tall, and he came in from outside recently because there's still cold in his coat." She paused. "He's watching me, but not like most people watch me." Elena looked at Jacob. He was watching Grace with an expression of complete, undisguised attention. Not the soft pity attention that Grace hated, but the focused attention of someone who was observing something he was genuinely trying to understand. Elena wrote on the ledger and turned it toward him. "She knows you're watching her. She can tell by the absence of sound from your direction." Jacob read it. He thought for a moment. Then he picked up the pencil and wrote and turned the ledger toward Grace's direction, which struck Elena as interesting, as a reflex, since Grace couldn't read the writing. He caught himself, and then, instead of looking embarrassed, he did something unexpected. He came around the counter, stood in front of Grace at a comfortable distance, and waited. Grace turned her face toward him. He reached out slowly, slowly enough that his approach was audible, and held out one hand, palm up, at about the level of her shoulder. He waited. Grace reached out and found his hand. She put both of hers over it and stood there for a moment, feeling. His hands were large, work-roughed, with the particular callus patterns of someone who carved, the inner edges of the fingers, the heel of the right palm. "You make things," Grace said. He couldn't hear her. But he was watching her face and her mouth, and some part of it must have been readable because he nodded once. Grace's expression changed. Not dramatically. Grace's expressions rarely changed dramatically because she'd learned early that her face was often being read by people who were looking for signals she wasn't trying to send. But something in it shifted from the guarded professional interest face she wore with most new people to something that was simply present. "He's not afraid of me," she said to Elena. "I know," Elena said. Grace was still holding his hand. She turned her face slightly to the sides, the listening angle, and said, "Does he know I can't see him?" Elena wrote it. Jacob read it. He picked up the pencil with his free hand. Grace was still holding the other, and wrote one word, "Yes." Elena read it to Grace. "Yes." Grace nodded slowly. She released his hand. "Good," she said. "I don't like it when people forget and then act surprised." Elena wrote that too. Jacob's almost smile returned. He came back on Thursday. And the Thursday after that. It developed, these visits, not into anything that had a name yet, but into a pattern that all three of them seemed to accept without discussion as simply the way things were going to be for a while. He would come in the late morning before Elena's afternoon customers, and they would sit at the cutting table with the ledger between them and talk in the slow way that writing requires, which was, Elena found, not entirely worse than spoken conversation. Writing slowed things down. It made you choose what to say more carefully. It cut out the automatic filler sounds, the and well, and left something that was closer to what you actually meant. Grace was always there. She participated freely, announcing her contributions out loud and waiting for Elena to write the responses, which created a strange triangulated conversation that shouldn't have worked and did anyway. Not smoothly, nothing about it was smooth, but in the way that things work when everyone involved is making a genuine effort and nobody is pretending the awkwardness isn't there. On the fourth visit, Jacob brought two things. The first was a small carved figure, a woman sitting in a chair with her hands in her lap, which Grace held for a long time, running her fingers over it with the fine, reading attention she brought to everything physical. The second thing was harder to describe. It was a flat wooden board, about the size of a checkerboard, with a series of raised lines and dots worked into its surface, not random, she could see, in a pattern that meant something even if she couldn't immediately tell what. He set it on the table in front of Grace and guided her hands to it. Grace's fingers moved across it. She went still. "These are letters," she said. Elena looked at Jacob, who was watching Grace's face. She wrote, "Did you make a raised letter alphabet?" He read it, nodded, wrote, "I heard there was a way. I didn't know the right system. I worked out my own." He paused, then added, "It's probably wrong." Elena wrote, "Grace, he made you a raised letter board so you could read with your fingers. He says the system is probably wrong." Grace ran her fingers across it again. Her mouth was moving slightly as she worked it out. "It's not wrong," she said. "It's different. There's a school in Paris that has a system. I learned about it before we left Pittsburgh. It's not the same, but it's the same idea." She traced one of the symbols. "This one is A." Elena wrote, "She says it's not wrong. It's just a different version of a real system." Jacob read it. Something happened in his face that was hard to define. A look that wasn't pride exactly, because pride in this context would have been misplaced, but something closer to relief. The look of someone who has spent time on something in solitude, not knowing if it was right, and has just found out it was at least close. "Ask him why he made it," Grace said. Elena wrote the question. Jacob read it, and then sat back slightly in his chair, and looked at the board, and wrote slowly, "Because she's been in this town for 3 weeks, and nobody has tried to give her a new way in." Elena read it. She set down the pencil and sat for a moment with that sentence. Then she read it aloud to Grace. Grace was quiet for a moment. "A new way in," she repeated. "Yes. Tell him that's the right way to think about it." Her fingers were still on the board. "Most people think about what I can't do. I thought about what I could do if I had the right thing." Elena wrote it. Jacob read it, and this time the expression was not almost a smile. It was the actual thing, brief and unguarded and not at all performed, and it changed his face considerably. The system became a project. What started as Jacob's rough raised letterboard expanded over the following weeks into something more deliberate. Jacob brought books from Denver, ordered through Harker's at what must have been considerable expense, given the shipping cost, about the Paris system that Grace had mentioned, the formal raised dot alphabet that had been developed for blind readers. He couldn't read the French sections, but the diagrams were clear enough. He spent evenings in his workshop on the mountain, Elena learned later, reworking his original board to match the proper system, carving the dots with a tool he modified specifically for the purpose, a small punch with a rounded tip that made consistent impressions. Grace learned it with unnerving speed. Within 2 weeks, she had the full alphabet. Within a month, she was asking whether it was possible to make raised dots on paper rather than wood, because wood was heavy and you couldn't read it lying down. Jacob worked out a method using a sharpened awl and a backing board that allowed the paper to receive the impression without tearing. He made her a kit: the awl, the board, a guide frame that kept the rows straight, a supply of thick paper that could hold the dots without degrading. Elena watched all of this happen and felt things about it that she didn't entirely know what to do with. She had spent 8 years being the person who figured out what Grace needed and found ways to provide it or improvise it or go without. And it had been entirely her responsibility and entirely her weight to carry. And she had carried it without complaint because there was no one else to carry it, and complaining would have required energy she needed for other things. And now there was this man, this silent, careful man, who came down from the mountain with his hands full of things he'd made, who looked at Grace and saw not a situation to manage, but a person to equip, and who went away and thought and came back with something. She did not know what to do with gratitude that large. She had not had occasion to feel it before. She also did not know what to do with the fact that she had started to look forward to Thursdays with a feeling she would have been embarrassed to name. The trouble came from Thomas Brennan, as trouble in Timber Ridge usually did, in the second month. She'd been aware of him, peripherally, in the way you're aware of bad weather on the horizon. Not immediate, not yet requiring response, but impossible to forget entirely. He owned property in town and had authority at the mine, and both of those things meant he was present in conversations she wasn't part of. She heard his name. She heard through Carl and through the gradual accumulation of information that came from being the woman who fixed everyone's clothes and therefore occupied a neutral position in their lives, that Brennan was not pleased by how quickly Elena had established herself. This struck her as both predictable and faintly ridiculous. He had rejected her. He had sent her away from the platform in front of half the town. That she had then found work in a workshop and was slowly, imperfectly, building something out of the wreckage of his refusal seemed like it should be no business of his. But men like Brennan, she had learned, did not think in those terms. For them, the woman they had discarded remaining present in the same town was its own kind of affront. The first sign of it was when 2 of her customers canceled in the same week. Not dramatically, not with explanation, just brief notes through Marta's to say that they would not be needing the alterations after all, sorry for any inconvenience. Elena looked at the 2 cancellations and thought, 2 is coincidence or 2 is something else, and waited. Carl told her, at the end of the week, without quite meeting her eyes, Brennan said something at the supervisor's dinner about you. Something about how it wasn't seemly for a woman in her situation to be operating a commercial establishment without proper backing. Elena set down the coat she was folding. My situation. He didn't say exactly. Carl was clearly uncomfortable. But the meaning was plain enough. He means the proposal that he himself rejected. Yes, she folded the coat. And the women who canceled, were their husbands at the dinner? Carl said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Elena thought about this for the rest of the day, turning it over with the same methodical attention she gave to a knotted seam. Not with anger, because anger required energy she didn't have to spare, but with the practical focus of someone trying to figure out exactly where the damage was and whether it could be addressed. Grace, who had been at the letterboard when Carl came and said nothing during the conversation, said, after Carl left, "He's trying to make you seem disreputable." "Yes. Because your being here reminds people that he behaved badly. That's probably part of it. What are you going to do?" Elena sat down at the treadle machine. "Keep working," she said. "Do good work. Let it be visible. That's what you do when someone tries to undermine you with words. You make the work speak louder than the words." Grace considered this. "That's a long strategy," she said. "Most good strategies are." "What if it doesn't work fast enough?" Elena didn't answer that. She started the machine. What she was thinking was, I have made it through worse with less. I have made it through 3 years in Pittsburgh with $12 and a blind child and a dead husband and a landlord who had no patience. I have made it through 2 cancellations. But what she was also thinking was, Brennan has power here that I don't, and power like that doesn't stay quiet when it feels threatened. She was right about that. She just didn't know yet what shape it would take. Jacob came that Thursday, and she told him what had happened. She wrote it out carefully. The dinner, the cancellations, the thing Carl had said, because writing forced her to be clear about it, to say it plainly without the softening she might have done in spoken language without realizing. Jacob read it. He sat for a moment after. His face did the thing it did when he was thinking seriously. A stillness that was not blankness but concentration, the way still water isn't empty. He wrote, "How many customers do you have that he can reach?" She thought about it. Maybe half. The mine workers and their families who depend on his goodwill. He wrote, "And the other half? Women with their own income or whose husbands work independent. The 3 families on the north side. Marta." She paused. Nora Finch, maybe. She came back for her coat and ordered 2 more pieces. Jacob read this and wrote, "Nora Finch's husband is not a supervisor. He's a safety engineer. He doesn't report to Brennan." She looked at him. "You know the mine structure?" He wrote, "I was there for 11 years before the accident." She hadn't known that. She'd known about the hearing loss, the broad outlines that Carl had told her and Grace. She hadn't known 11 years. She thought about a man spending 11 years underground, learning every seam and shaft, and then losing the thing that mining required most. The ability to hear the mountain telling you what it was about to do. She wrote, "I'm sorry." He read it, looked at her, wrote, "It was a long time ago. The point is I know which families in this town are independent of Brennan and which aren't." He paused. Then, "Would it help if I told you?" She looked at this offer. It was practical. It was the kind of help that actually helped. Not sympathy, not the softening noises, but information. Specific, useful, actionable information. She wrote, yes, it would. He wrote it out. He was methodical and thorough, going through the families he knew, indicating the connection to the mine, the degree of dependence. His handwriting was getting faster as he went, less careful, more certain, the handwriting of someone who'd been holding this knowledge in his head and was now finding it useful to have it on paper. When he was finished, she read through it twice. Then she looked up. He was watching her the way he watched things, fully, without the half-attention most people offered. She had gotten used to being looked at that way. She was still getting used to what it felt like. She wrote, "Why are you helping me?" He read it. He picked up the pencil and held it for a moment without writing. Then, "Because what Brennan did at the station was wrong, and it keeps being wrong every week that he gets to make it harder for you." He stopped, looked at what he'd written, added, "And because Grace deserves better than a town run by a man who called her defective." Elaine read this twice. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the ledger page that now held 2 months of their conversations. Her careful printing and his less careful but legible script, layered over each other in a record of something she didn't yet have a name for. "What did he write?" Grace asked, from her corner. She had been at the letterboard, but she'd been listening to the silence the way she listened to everything. Elena read it aloud. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's a good person." Elena looked at Jacob, who hadn't heard Grace say it. "I was looking at this window, his face in its usual contained expression, the mountain outside the back glass." "Yes," Elena said quietly. "I think he might be." The drum came on a Wednesday, unexpectedly. Jacob didn't usually come on Wednesdays. Elena heard the door and looked up from the machine, surprised, and he was standing in the entrance with something under his arm, a large, flat object wrapped in oilcloth, and behind him, visible through the open door, was his horse with a loaded pack. He set the oilcloth package on the cutting table and unwrapped it. It was a drum, or rather it was a frame, a shallow circular frame of bent wood, perhaps 18 inches across, covered in stretched hide that had been treated to a particular tautness. It was elegant in the way his carving was elegant. Nothing extra, nothing wasted, every element serving its purpose. Around the edge of the frame he had fitted, at intervals, small wooden pegs, each one a slightly different length. Grace had come to the table the moment she heard the oilcloth being removed. She found the edge of the frame and ran her fingers around it. She found the pegs. She pressed her fingertips to the stretched hide. "It's a drum," she said. Elena wrote it to Jacob, even though she assumed he knew. He nodded. He picked up the pencil and wrote, "The pegs are different lengths. Each one makes a different vibration when you press the drum near it. Different notes feel different through the skin." Elena read it to Grace and watched her daughter's face change. Grace pressed her palm flat against the hide. She spread her fingers. Then, very gently, she tapped once, near the edge. She felt it. She moved her hand slightly and tapped again. She moved again. Her eyes were closed, which was not the same for Grace as it was for most people. She didn't close her eyes to see better. She closed them to reduce the distraction of light and shadow and concentrate everything in her hands and her skin. She tapped a pattern, stopped, tapped it again. "The sound goes into my hand," she said. She said it in the voice she used when she was reporting information, not performing emotion. "And also into the table. I can feel it in my feet." Elena wrote this. Jacob read it and nodded. He picked up the pencil and wrote slowly, "That's what I thought. The vibration travels. You can feel music without hearing it." He paused, then added, "I tested it. I put my hands on the drum, and someone struck different notes on a piano. I couldn't hear the notes, but I could feel the difference." Elena read this aloud. Grace was quiet for a moment. "You made this for me," she said. Elena wrote it, Jacob read it, and looked at Grace and wrote one word, "Yes." Grace took her hands off the drum and held them in front of her, palms up, looking at them in the particular way she looked at things that weren't quite visible even in the direction she was facing. "I've never felt music before," she said. "I've heard it, but that's different." Elena's throat did something she was not expecting. She sat with it for a moment before she trusted herself to write anything, and then she wrote what Grace had said and handed the ledger to Jacob and looked at her sewing machine while he read it. When she looked back, his face had done the thing she'd only seen it do once before, when he'd learned that his raised letterboard had been at least close to right. The relief in something else, older than relief, that she thought might be the expression of a person who has made something that actually works for the person it was made for. Grace tapped the drum again. She tapped it in a pattern, slow, deliberate, feeling each note travel through her hands and wrists and up into her shoulders. She tapped it for a long time, while the afternoon light moved through the workshop windows and the mountain outside went from gold to shadow, and neither Elena nor Jacob said anything, which was not the same as silence. It was the sound of something being built. The drum stayed in the workshop. Grace had asked, on the evening Jacob brought it, whether it could remain there rather than go upstairs to the boarding house room, and her reasoning was practical. The workshop had more floor space, and floor space mattered when you were learning to feel vibration through your feet as well as your hands. Elena had agreed, and Jacob had nodded when she wrote it to him, and so the drum lived in the back corner of the workshop on a low wooden stand that Jacob built for it the following week, fitted with felt pads on the legs so the vibration transferred down into the floorboards rather than getting absorbed by the stand itself. He had thought of that on his own. Elena noticed these things, the way his solutions came pre-considered, already accounting for variables he'd worked out in advance. It was the thinking of someone who had spent a long time alone with problems and no one to hand them off to. Grace practiced every morning before the first customer arrived. She had developed a method. She would stand on the floor near the drum with her shoes off, feeling the vibration through her bare feet, and tap with both hands in patterns she was inventing. Not music exactly, not yet, but a language she was building from the ground up, the way she built all her languages. Elena would watch from the treadle machine and feel something she had no clean word for, some compound of joy and sorrow and ordinary exhaustion that was probably just what it felt like to be the mother of a remarkable person and not quite have the resources to give them everything they deserved. She didn't say any of that. She ran the machine and let Grace play. It was during one of these morning sessions, in the third week of May, that Nora Finch came in early and stopped in the doorway and watched Grace for a full minute without saying anything. When Grace finished her pattern and lifted her hands, Nora said, "How does she know when to stop?" "She feels it resolve," Elena said. "The same way you hear a note resolve." Nora looked at her. "You understand music?" "Enough. Henry, my husband, he played the harmonica. Not well, but with commitment." She turned back to the seam she was running. Grace always responded to it more than he did. Nora came inside and sat in the customer chair, which was a wooden chair Elena had placed near the front window for people waiting on work. She sat in it the way a person sits when they're not entirely sure why they've arrived early and are working out the reason as they go. "I want to tell you something," Nora said. "All right." "My husband, Robert, he spoke to some of the other engineers this week, the independent ones, about the situation with your customers." She paused. "He did it without telling me he was going to, and I found out after, And I want to be clear that I didn't ask him to, but I also... She stopped again. I'm not sorry he did. Elena stopped the machine. What did he say? That Brennan had no grounds to say what he said at the dinner. That you came here under a legitimate arrangement that Brennan himself broke, and that making it difficult for you to work was... She chose her word carefully. Petty. That's one word for it. Robert isn't a man who uses strong language normally, Nora said. Petty is strong language for him. Elena looked at her. Nora had the expression of someone delivering information they hoped would be received as an offering rather than an intrusion, and was not entirely sure which it was. Tell Robert I'm grateful, Elena said. He said 2 of the families who canceled might come back. Nora looked at Grace, who had gone to her letterboard in the corner and was working through something with the awl and thick paper. He also said, and this is Robert, not me, that Brennan has been making decisions at the mine lately that don't sit right with some of the engineers. Things about the east shaft ventilation. Robert didn't explain the details. He doesn't bring the mine home normally, but he said it in the context of Brennan being the kind of man who makes decisions based on what's convenient for himself rather than what's right. Elena filed this information in the careful part of her mind that kept track of things that might matter later. Thank you, she said, for coming early to tell me. I came early, Nora said, because I didn't want anyone to see me come in and report it back to Brennan that I was here, and the morning is quieter. She stood and smoothed her skirt, which is a ridiculous thing in a town where I've lived for 8 years. But there it is. After she left, Grace said without looking up from the letterboard, she's afraid of him too. A lot of people are. But she came anyway. Yes, Elena said. She did. Jacob came that Thursday with mud on his boots and a cut on his left hand that he hadn't bothered to properly bandage, a strip of cloth wound loosely around the palm, already stained through. Elena saw it the moment he came in and pointed at it with a look that required no writing. He looked at his hand as though he'd half forgotten it was there. He wrote, "Slipped on the upper trail, rock edge." She pointed at the chair. He sat. She went to the supplies she kept. She'd started keeping a small medical kit after the 3rd time a customer came in with a sewing needle through a fingertip and cleaned the cut and put a proper dressing on it, which was a task that required holding his hand and working around the wound with steady attention. His hands were very still while she worked. He didn't move or flinch, just watched her face with that complete attention. She finished and wrote, "You should have done this before coming down the mountain." He wrote, "I know." Then, after a pause, "I wanted to show Grace something, and I didn't want to wait until it healed." She looked at him. He had a leather satchel with him that she hadn't examined. He opened it now and took out a book. Small, well-worn, with a plain board cover. He set it on the table. It was written in raised dots. Elena looked at it. She understood slowly what she was looking at. A book in the formal raised dot alphabet, the one Grace had described from the school in Pittsburgh, the one Jacob had used to correct his original carved board. This was not something from Harker's supply order. This had been brought from somewhere deliberate. She wrote, "Where did you get this?" He wrote, "Denver. I went last week." Denver was a 2-day ride. She looked at him. He was looking at the book, not at her. She wrote, "You rode to Denver for a book." He wrote, "I rode to Denver for several things." The book was one of them. He looked up. "It's a collection of stories. I didn't know what she'd already read, so I chose stories." Elena called Grace from the corner. Grace came and Jacob put the book in her hands and guided her fingers to the cover. She felt the dots there. A title, Elena assumed, though she couldn't read it. Grace's fingers moved across it slowly, then faster. Her face changed in the way Elena had learned to read over 8 years. The slight parting of the lips, the forward tilt of the head, the quality of absolute concentration that meant something had caught her completely. "It's a book," Grace said. "Yes," Elena said, "a real book, with real words." Her fingers were moving across the cover, reading. It says, "Stories from the Prairie." She looked up, and the look on her face was the look Elena had seen once before, at the piano at the school in Pittsburgh, when Grace had played back a piece from memory, and the teacher had first understood what they were dealing with. Not triumph, something quieter and more private than triumph. The expression of a person receiving something they had stopped letting themselves expect. She held the book against her chest for a moment with both arms. Jacob was watching her. Elena watched him watching her, and thought again about a man who rode to Denver with a cut hand he hadn't properly dressed because he didn't want to wait until it healed. She wrote, "She's never had a book of her own she could read." Jacob read it. His face did nothing dramatic. He just sat with it. The East Shaft had been a subject of careful, quiet concern among certain people in Timber Ridge for most of that spring, though the concern was the kind that circulated in spaces Brennan didn't occupy. In tables, in the boarding house parlor, in the spaces between sentences when miners talked to their wives, and said it feels different down there in the tone that meant they weren't going to say anything more specific because specifics made things more real. Elena knew about it only because she knew almost everything that moved through Timber Ridge by now, 3 months in. The workshop had become a kind of unofficial exchange point, the way a good barbershop or a boarding house kitchen becomes, a place where people came regularly for a service and stayed for the conversation, and where information accumulated in the corners like dust, unremarked and constant. She heard the East Shaft mentioned in late May. She heard it again in early June. She heard from Carl that 2 of the newer miners had asked Brennan about the ventilation in the East Tunnel, and Brennan had told them to get back to work. She filed it. She didn't know what to do with it. It was mine business, which meant it was Brennan's business. And Brennan had made it comprehensively clear that nothing of Elena's concern was welcome in his territory. What she did know, from Jacob, was the mountain. He had told her, across 4 months of Thursday ledger conversations, and the occasional extra visit that had started happening without either of them naming the change, more about the geology of the Timber Ridge Valley than she'd ever expected to know. He knew it the way a man knows a place he has lived with for years, not from books, but from direct attention. Where the water moved, where the rock fractured, which faces of the ridge shed loose material in thaw, which sections of the valley floor were older than they looked. He had worked the mine for 11 years. He knew the mountain from both sides. On the second Thursday of June, he came down from the mountain with a look on his face that was different from his usual expression. Not alarmed. Jacob rarely looked alarmed, having apparently trained himself long ago in the kind of composure that comes from living alone with large amounts of silence. But there was a tightness around his eyes that she'd learned over months to read as the signal that something was wrong and he was deciding how to say it. He sat down and picked up the pencil without preamble. He wrote, "There's been movement in the upper east face. I've been watching it for 2 weeks. 3 rock falls in the section above the east shaft." Elena looked at this. She wrote, "What does that mean?" He wrote, "It means the mountain is shifting. When the upper face moves, pressure transfers to the structures below." He paused. "In the mine, that means the east shaft." She looked at him. "Have you told anyone?" He looked at her with the expression she recognized as the one he wore when she'd asked something that had a history she didn't fully know yet. He wrote, "I went to Brennan 4 years ago about a similar movement in the south face. He told me I wasn't a miner anymore and my opinion wasn't relevant." Elena sat with this for a moment. She wrote, "Who else would listen?" He thought. "Robert Finch." She looked at the name. She thought about Nora coming in early, afraid to be seen. She thought about Robert Finch using the word petty in a context that apparently included mine ventilation decisions made for convenience rather than safety. She wrote, "I can talk to Nora." Jacob read it. He looked uncertain, which was, she had learned, a rarer expression on his face than most and therefore more significant when it appeared. He wrote, "I don't want to put you in Brennan's way again." She wrote back before she'd fully decided she was going to, "I'm already in Brennan's way. I've been in Brennan's way since I stepped off the train. I'd rather be in his way for something that matters." He read it. He looked at her for a moment with that full attention. He wrote, "All right, well." Nora listened to Elena in the front room of her house on a Wednesday afternoon with the careful stillness of a woman who has learned to keep her face neutral when receiving information that frightens her. When Elena finished, Nora said, "Jacob Thorne told you this?" "Yes." "He watched the east face for 2 weeks before coming to you?" "That's what he said." "And he went to Brennan about a similar thing 4 years ago and was dismissed?" "Yes." Nora sat back. She folded her hands in her lap. "Robert has been saying, not to me, to the other engineers. And I hear things because Robert talks in his sleep, and also because Meg Hartwell's husband is an engineer, and Meg tells me things. She stopped herself. Robert has been saying that the east shaft bracing is undersupported. Brennan approved a cost reduction in March that replaced the planned timber bracing with a lighter grade. Robert signed off on it because Brennan outranks him and he didn't have hard numbers yet. He's been trying to get hard numbers. Jacob's observations would be numbers, Elena said, or at least supporting evidence. If Jacob put them in writing, he wrote me everything he told me. I have it. Nora looked at her hands. If Robert takes this to the company office in Denver, Brennan will know where it came from. He'll know Robert spoke to you. I know. It will make things harder for you. Things are already hard, Elena said. How hard is the question? There was a pause. Outside Nora's front window, the afternoon light was the particular gold of mountain summer, the kind that makes everything look slightly more permanent than it is. I'll talk to Robert tonight, Nora said. Robert Finch was a quiet man who communicated primarily in numbers and structural assessments, and appeared to feel that these were adequate to most situations. He came to the workshop 2 days later, on a Friday morning when Elena had no customers scheduled, and he came alone and without announcement. He stood at the counter with Jacob's written account in his hand. Elena had given Nora the pages from the ledger, and read through it a second time while Elena waited. He documented the dates, Robert said. Yes. And the specific locations on the face. He knows the mountain well. Robert set the pages down. He was a man of about 45, lean, with the careful squint of someone who spent time assessing things that could fall on him. I need to go up with him, he said, to the east face, to see what he's seeing. Elena wrote to Jacob that same afternoon, on a separate sheet that she folded and gave to the boy who ran errands for Marta, who knew the trail to Jacob's place because he delivered supplies there twice before. The reply came back by the next morning, Saturday. I'll meet him at the east trailhead at 8. Robert went up on Saturday. He came back in the afternoon with mud on his boots and a look on his face that was the engineer's version of Jacob's tight around the eyes expression. Contained alarm, the alarm of someone who has just had a number confirmed that they had been hoping would come back different. He came to the workshop directly from the trail. He's right, Robert said. The movement is consistent with pressure transfer to the structures below. Given the current bracing grade, he stopped. We need to get word to the company office in Denver, not through Brennan, directly. Will they listen? They'll have to. If I document it formally, with Thorne's observations as supporting evidence, they can't ignore it without accepting the liability. He picked up his hat from the counter. I'm going to write the report tonight. I'll send it Monday. He left. Elena sat for a while at the cutting table after he'd gone, with her hands flat on the surface, feeling the stillness of the workshop. Grace was in the corner with her book. She had been reading, slowly, working through it, for the past hour, her fingers moving across the pages with the focused quiet of someone in deep water. Something is happening, Grace said. Yes. Something that matters. I think so. Grace closed the book over her finger to mark the page. Is it going to be dangerous? Elena thought about Jacob's 2 weeks of silent watching on the mountain. She thought about Robert Finch's face coming down the trail. She thought about the east shaft, underground, men working in it every day. I don't know yet, she said. I hope not. The explosion came on a Tuesday. It was the 3rd week of June, mid-morning, when the workshop was quiet and Grace was at the drum, and Elena was 3 hours into a difficult alteration on a wool riding coat that had been badly cut to begin with. The sound arrived before anything else. Not the sharp crack she might have expected, but a low, heavy concussion that she felt in her sternum before she heard it, the kind of sound that moves through rock rather than air. Grace took her hands off the drum and stood up. Elena was already moving toward the door. Outside, the sound had already changed the town. People were coming out of buildings with the confused, accelerating urgency of those who had heard something wrong and were trying to determine in which direction wrong lay. From the direction of the mine, the east end of the valley, a plume of dust and gray smoke was rising against the mountain with the particular quality of something that was still in the process of becoming itself. Carl was running past the workshop. East shaft, he said without stopping. She blew. Elena stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then she went back into the workshop and went to the supply cabinet and took out everything she had. The medical kit, the extra cotton she kept for backing, 2 full bolts of clean white muslin that she'd ordered 2 weeks ago for a large curtain commission, The scissors, the needle cases. She bundled what she could carry and looked at Grace. "Come with me," she said. "Stay right with me." "I know," Grace said. They went out into the street, which had already become a river of movement. Men toward the mine, women with the particular faces of people calculating what they might be needed for. Elena went with the men. She was not a nurse. She had no medical training beyond common sense and 12 years of managing household injuries, which in their Pittsburgh years had included 2 broken fingers, a kitchen burn that had taken 3 weeks to heal, and Henry's mining tool gash in his forearm that she'd stitched herself because the doctor was 3 miles away and the bleeding wasn't waiting. She went because she had clean cloth, and she could cut bandages faster than most people because that was exactly the motion, length, width, consistent pressure, that her hands had spent years learning. The scene at the mine entrance was not orderly. There were 20 or 30 men around the east shaft entrance, some coming out, some trying to go back in, voices overlapping in that particular kind of group panic, where everyone is trying to direct and nobody is coordinating. Dust was still coming out of the shaft opening in slow billows. The smell was bad, sulfur and something underneath it that was more organic, and that Elena did not investigate too closely. She found the most controlled person in the vicinity, which was a man named Hobbs, who was the mine's surface manager, a solid, deliberate man she'd met once through Carl, and she went straight to him. "I have clean cloth," she said. "Where do you need me?" Hobbs looked at her. He looked at the cloth. He pointed to an area to the left of the shaft entrance where several men had been laid out on the ground. Not dead, she could see movement, and said, "There. Don't let them wander. Some of them are going to try to go back in." She went there. Grace was at her side. 2 of the men had lacerations. One had a burn on his right arm that she did not look at longer than necessary to assess, because looking at it longer than necessary would not help either of them. She started cutting strips of muslin, long, even, the way she cut fabric for any other purpose, keeping her hands steady on the principle that steady hands communicate themselves to the person you're working on. "Talk to me," she told the man with the laceration. "Tell me your name." "Wes," he said. His voice was wrong, too high, the voice of someone whose nervous system was still catching up with what had happened to his body. "Wes, I'm going to put pressure on your arm. It's going to feel tight. That's the point." She wrapped the strip. "Are there men still down there?" "At least 6, maybe 8. We don't—" The shaft came down about 40 feet in. "Maybe more." He was breathing too fast. "Jensen and the Kowalski brothers for sure. They were at the working face." She kept her hands moving. "Jensen has children?" 4. Wife's expecting another." "Then we're going to get the shaft clear," she said. She said it not because she knew it was true, but because it was the sentence that needed to fill the air at that moment, and because someone needed to say it steadily. Grace was kneeling beside the man with the burn, not touching him. She'd learned quickly on the walk over that touching a burn victim without warning was a bad idea, but talking to him in the low, clear voice she used when she was delivering information. "The burning feeling," Grace was saying, "is the skin's response. It's doing its job. What you want to do is breathe slowly. The air up here is clean. You're breathing clean air." Elena glanced at her daughter. 9 years old, on her knees in the mine yard dirt, talking a grown man through a burn with the calm authority of someone who dealt in facts rather than fear. The burned man's breathing steadied. Elena looked back at Wes's arm and kept rapping. "Whoa!" Jacob arrived at the mine yard 40 minutes after the explosion. Elena didn't see him come in. She heard about him first. A ripple of information through the men around the shaft entrance. The way information ripples when someone does something notable. He was at the mountain's east face when it blew. He'd been watching it. He'd come down the trail faster than the trail was designed for and arrived with ropes and the particular knowledge of a man who had worked that mountain from both inside and outside for 11 years. She saw him when he came out of the shaft entrance the first time. He was covered in dust, a rope over his shoulder, and he was walking fast toward Hobbs and writing on a folded piece of paper as he walked. Writing while walking, which she had never seen him do, the handwriting surely terrible but legible enough that Hobbs read it, and his face changed. Hobbs started giving orders. The men around the entrance reorganized. Jacob went back in. He went in 3 times. Each time he came out and wrote fast and gave the paper to Hobbs and went back in. On the 3rd time he came out with 2 men. Jensen was one of them, she found out later, the man with 4 children and a 5th coming. and the two miners came out coughing, and one of them was being half carried, and Jacob had his arm under the man's shoulder and was steering him with the careful, leveraged economy of someone who understood load-bearing. He handed the men to the people waiting and turned to go back in. Elena was there. She didn't plan to be. She'd come over to bring clean wrapping to the area near the shaft entrance, and then Jacob was right in front of her. He was covered in gray dust, and there was a cut on his forehead she suspected he didn't know about. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was no ledger here, no pencil, no system. She held up 3 fingers, pointed into the shaft, made a questioning gesture. He held up 2, then touched his own chest and pointed down. 2 more. He was going back in. She nodded. She held up the roll of clean cloth she was carrying, pointed at his forehead, raised her eyebrows. He touched his forehead, looked at the blood on his fingers, and made the gesture she recognized, the slight outward wave of the hand that meant this can wait. She held up the cloth again. He stayed still for 3 seconds. Then he bent his head forward slightly, which was the pragmatic acknowledgement that she was going to do this regardless, and they would all proceed faster if he cooperated. She pressed a folded pad of muslin to the cut and wrapped it quickly, the way she'd wrapped Wes, firm and even, no wasted motion. When she stepped back, he looked at her again. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not because he was hurt, but because there was no space in this moment for the composure he usually maintained between himself and the world. He looked, for a moment, exactly like what he was. A man who had been doing something frightening for 40 minutes and was about to do it again, and who was looking at someone he trusted before going back. She pointed at the mountain, then at him, then put both fists over her heart. It was not a gesture with a prior agreed meaning. She wasn't entirely sure what she intended by it, but he read it and nodded and went back into the shaft. All 6 men came out. It took another hour and a half, and 2 sections of the shaft had to be shored before the last 2 could be retrieved. And by the time it was done, the mine yard had the particular quality of a space where something terrible has happened and then been narrowly averted. The exhausted relief that isn't quite celebration because it still remembers what it was afraid of 20 minutes ago. Brennan appeared during the 3rd hour. Elena saw him come through the mine yard gate with 2 men from the company office. She recognized one of them as the company's regional superintendent, a man named Caldwell who had arrived from Denver by horse at a pace that suggested Robert's report had gone upward and had been received. Brennan's face had the expression of a man who has discovered that several conversations he was not part of have been happening, and who is now counting the cost. He looked at the scene. He looked at Elena among the men near the shaft entrance. He looked at Jacob coming out of the shaft for the last time, the final 2 miners behind him. He did not say anything to Elena. He did not say anything to Jacob. He walked with Caldwell toward the shaft entrance with the particular posture of a man who has lost some portion of a battle he didn't know he was in. Grace was sitting against the outside wall of the shaft house, the drum nowhere present. She'd left it in the workshop, with her hands flat on the ground on either side of her, feeling whatever the ground was still giving off. She had been there for the last hour, after the men near her had been stable enough to leave. 3 children who had followed parents to the mine yard and then become separated from them in the chaos had found their way to Grace, drawn, Elena supposed, by the quality of stillness she gave off, the lack of alarm, and were sitting near her in a rough half-circle. She was talking to them. Elena couldn't hear what she was saying from across the yard. She crossed to them. As she got closer, she could hear Grace's voice, low and even, saying, "The mountain is settling, that's all. It's finding a new balance. It does that sometimes. Mountains aren't still. Most people just don't notice. The sound is the mountain finding where it wants to be." One of the children, a boy, maybe 7, was leaning against Grace's shoulder. He had his eyes closed. His breathing had slowed. Elena stood and looked at her daughter. Grace turned her face toward her. She didn't say anything. She just put one hand over the boys and stayed where she was. The afternoon light was long and golden on the mine yard, and the dust from the shaft was settling, and somewhere behind her Elena could hear Caldwell asking questions in the clipped tone of a man who is counting what things will cost, and Brennan's voice answering with less certainty than usual. Carl came to stand beside her. He looked at Grace and the children. "She kept those 3 calm for 2 hours," he said quietly. 2 of them were crying when they got here. He stopped. She just talked to them until they weren't anymore. "She's good with frightened people," Elena said. She's good with people, Carl said. Full stop. Elena looked at Grace and the boy leaning against her, the other two children close by, all of them settled in the dusty afternoon light. She thought about those mornings 16 days after she'd arrived in Timber Ridge, when she'd walked with $2.40 and no plan, and a hand in hers that was steady when it had every reason not to be. She thought about what it had cost, these 4 months, and what had accumulated on the other side of that cost. She did not look for Jacob. She knew he was behind her somewhere in the yard, talking with Hobbs and Caldwell in the written word way that took longer but got there. And she knew that what he'd done in the shaft today would be in every conversation in Timber Ridge for a long time. She knew other things too, things she was not ready to look at directly yet. She knew them the way you know the shape of something in the dark, by where it is, not what it looks like. She would look at it later. Right now she crossed the yard and sat down next to Grace, and Grace shifted slightly to make room, and the children didn't move, and the four of them sat in the dust with the mountain settling around them and the afternoon going quiet and long in every direction. Caldwell stayed in Timber Ridge for 4 days. He was a methodical man, the regional superintendent, the kind who kept a leather notebook and wrote in it constantly and asked questions in a sequence that suggested he already knew most of the answers and was verifying rather than discovering. He walked the mine. He walked the east shaft with Robert Finch. He read Robert's report and Jacob's written observations and asked to meet Jacob, which happened in Marta's boarding house parlor because it was the largest neutral space available, with Elena present as the intermediary who could write the exchanges fast enough to keep pace with a man who was used to getting information quickly. Caldwell asked Jacob about the east face. Jacob answered in the careful, specific way he answered everything: dates, locations, the precise description of where the rockfalls had occurred and what their pattern suggested about the pressure shift below. Caldwell wrote it all down. He asked about Jacob's background at the mine. Jacob wrote the 11 years, the accident, the hearing loss. Caldwell wrote that down too. At the end of the meeting, Caldwell looked at Jacob for a moment and said to Elena, "Tell him that his observations almost certainly prevented a worse outcome. If the shaft had continued operating without bracing correction, the second collapse would have been larger, significantly larger." Elena wrote it. Jacob read it and gave a short nod that acknowledged the information without performing gratitude for it. After Caldwell left the parlor, Elena wrote, "He's going to do something about Brennan." Jacob read it. He wrote, "Probably. The question is how much." She wrote, "Is that enough for you?" He looked at that question for a moment. He wrote, "It's not about enough for me. It's about whether the men in that shaft are safe going forward." He paused, then added, "The rest of it doesn't matter much." She looked at the rest of it and thought about 4 years ago, Brennan telling him his opinion wasn't relevant, and Jacob going back up the mountain and watching from outside because that was the only option left to him. She thought about what it cost a person to go back to watching something they couldn't fix, and then to come down and try to fix it anyway when the opportunity finally arrived. She wrote, "It matters to me." He read this and looked up at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been trying to find a name for since the mine yard, when she'd pressed the cloth to his forehead and made the gesture she hadn't planned. And he had looked at her with his composure gone and simply nodded. She still didn't have a name for it. She wasn't sure names were the right tools for it. Marta came in to clear the tea things and looked at the two of them and looked at the ledger and went back out without saying anything, which was its own kind of commentary. Caldwell's 4th day in Timber Ridge ended with a meeting at the mine office that Brennan did not emerge from looking the way he'd gone in. Elena didn't witness it. She heard about it from Carl, who heard about it from Hobbs, who was present because the surface operations fell under his purview and Caldwell had asked him to stay. What came out of the meeting was this: Brennan was removed from the foreman position pending a full company review of the bracing decisions made in the east shaft that spring. A temporary foreman was appointed from the engineering staff, not Robert Finch, who'd made clear he didn't want the position, but a man named Garrett from the Denver office, who would oversee operations until the review concluded. The review, Carl said, was expected to find what everyone already knew it would find. Brennan had cut costs in a way that shifted risk onto the men underground, and he had dismissed qualified concerns in order to avoid the inconvenience of being wrong. The company's liability exposure made the outcome essentially predetermined. Brennan left his house on the north side of Main Street on a Friday morning, 2 weeks after the explosion, with 3 hired men and a wagon. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, as far as Elena knew, because there was no one to say goodbye to who would have received it. She watched the wagon go from the workshop window without feeling what she'd expected to feel. She'd expected relief or some version of satisfaction, the settling of an account that had been opened since the train platform. What she felt instead was something more tired and more complicated, the feeling of someone watching the end of a thing that had cost more than it should have cost and was only ending now, too late for most of what it had taken. Grace was at the drum. She heard the wagon, the specific sound of a loaded vehicle on the rutted main road, and lifted her hands and turned her head. "He's leaving," she said. "Yes." She went back to the drum. She tapped once, a low note near the edge, and let it go. That was all either of them said about it. The shift in Timber Ridge after Brennan left was not dramatic. It was not the kind of change that announced itself. It was more like the change in a room when a window that has been painted shut is finally opened. The air doesn't suddenly transform, but something eases, and you realize only in retrospect how much pressure you'd been breathing against. The two families who had canceled their orders came back, not with apology. People rarely apologized in the direct way that was actually satisfying. They re-engaged instead. They came back with new work as though the gap hadn't existed. And Elena accepted this because re-engagement was the practical version of apology, and the practical version was what she could use. She took their orders and said nothing about the gap, and moved on. Because moving on was the discipline she'd been practicing for years, and she had gotten reasonably good at it. Nora Finch came in on the Monday after Brennan's departure and bought fabric for a dress she'd been putting off having made because she hadn't wanted to spend money at Elena's workshop while Brennan was watching. She said this directly, which Elena appreciated more than the indirect version would have been. "Robert wants to know," Nora said, while Elena was taking her measurements, "whether you'd be interested in having the workshop space permanently. He's spoken to Marta. This building is hers, as you know, and Marta said she'd transfer the arrangement to a proper lease if you wanted it." Elena held the measuring tape against Nora's shoulder. A permanent lease. At a fair rate. Robert worked out numbers with her. Nora turned her head slightly. "I know you didn't come here intending to stay." "I came here intending to get married," Elena said. "The intention didn't survive contact with the situation." "No." Nora was quiet while Elena noted the measurement. "Do you want to stay?" Elena wrote the number down. She looked at the workshop. The thread rack with Grace's notched spools, the treadle machine she'd coaxed back to working order, the cutting table with its shimmied leg, the drum in the corner on its felt-padded stand, the window that faced the mountain. 4 months of work. 4 months of the next thing, and then the next one. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." Jacob came that Thursday with no carved objects and no books and no projects under his arm. He came with nothing, which was unusual enough that Elena noticed it as he came through the door. He sat down at the cutting table. He picked up the pencil and held it and put it down. He picked it up again. He wrote, "I have to tell you something and I don't know how to start it." She wrote, "Start anywhere." He looked at that for a moment. He wrote, "I had a wife. Her name was Catherine, and a son. His name was Daniel. He was 4 years old." Elena sat very still. He wrote, "The accident that took my hearing, there was a fire after. Catherine and Daniel were in the section of the mine housing where the fire spread. I was in the shaft when it happened. I couldn't hear the alarm." Elena read this. She looked at his hands, which were very flat on the table, not holding the pencil now. He wrote, "I didn't know until I came up. The shaft foreman had to write it on a piece of paper and show me." He stopped. Started again. "I stayed in Timber Ridge because leaving felt like leaving them. The mountain was where it happened. I know that makes no sense." She wrote, "It makes complete sense." He read it. He wrote, "I stopped coming to town because every time I came down, I had to watch people having the things I didn't have anymore. Children, families. It was easier on the mountain." She wrote, "And then we arrived." He looked at what she'd written for a long time. He wrote, "And then you arrived." "And Grace?" He stopped, wrote over it, which he rarely did. "Grace reminded me that losing one way of knowing the world doesn't mean the world is gone. She reminded me of that. And I hadn't let anyone remind me of anything for a long time." Elena sat with this. She thought about a man building a raised letterboard in a workshop on a mountain at night, alone, not knowing if it was right, because a child he'd barely met needed a new way in. She thought about him riding to Denver with a cut hand he hadn't dressed. She wrote, Daniel would have been how old now? He did the math. He wrote, 15. She wrote, I'm sorry. He read it and nodded. It was the nod that meant the thing had been received rather than the nod that meant it had been resolved, and she was careful not to confuse those two things. He wrote, I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry. I'm telling you because you've let me be here, in this workshop, with you and Grace, for 4 months. And it has been... He stopped again. He wrote the last word and then looked at it. Enough. She looked at the word. Enough was not a romantic word. It was not a grand word. It was the word of someone who had spent a long time in a place where there was not enough of anything, and then found a place where there was, and was telling her exactly what that meant to him, which was more honest than most people managed with the bigger words. She wrote, Jacob. Then she wrote, You have been enough for us too, more than. He read this and did not write for a moment. Then he wrote, I don't know what I'm asking. I know I'm asking something. I don't want to ask wrong. She almost smiled. She wrote, You're not asking wrong. He wrote, I live on a mountain. She wrote, You come down most Thursdays. He wrote, The workshop is too small for a proper woodworking setup. She wrote, There's a building 2 lots down that's been empty since March. He looked at this. He wrote, You've been thinking about this. She wrote, I think about practical things. It's a habit. There was a pause. He picked up the pencil and turned it in his hand. He wrote, What about Grace? She wrote, Grace told me 6 weeks ago that you were a good person. That was before the mine. Grace's assessments are generally accurate. He sat with this. He wrote, She also told me, the second time I came here, that I smelled like pine resin and cold stone, and that those were good things to smell like. Elena looked up. Grace? She said. Grace looked up from the letterboard. What? Did you tell Jacob he smelled like pine resin? Grace considered this without any apparent embarrassment. I said pine resin and cold stone, she said. Those are accurate descriptions. Pine resin means he works with wood, which is true. Cold stone means he's been outside at elevation, which is also true. I was providing information. Elena wrote it to Jacob. He read it, and this time the smile was complete and unguarded, and she saw what his face looked like when it did that fully, and it was considerably different from the almost smile she'd been working with for 4 months. He wrote, She is the most honest person I have ever met. Elena wrote, She gets that from her father. He looked at the word father in that sentence and looked at Elena, and she felt the familiar tangle, the love for Henry that was real and permanent and did not require pretending it wasn't, and the thing she was feeling now that was also real and did not require pretending it wasn't, and the fact that both of those things could be true at the same time without one canceling the other. She had figured that out recently. It had taken longer than it should have. She wrote, Henry was honest. He was also stubborn, and sometimes bad with money, and he couldn't cook anything more complex than boiled eggs. He was not perfect, but he was good, and he was ours, and I loved him. She wrote, I'm telling you this because you told me about Catherine and Daniel, and because I don't want there to be things unsaid between us. Jacob read this carefully. He wrote, There don't have to be. She wrote, No, there don't. The building 2 lots down was owned by a man named Pierce, who had left Timber Ridge in April and left his property with Hobbs to manage because there was no one else. Hobbs mentioned it to Robert Finch, Robert mentioned it to Nora, and Nora came to the workshop on a Wednesday with the information and the rental rate, which was reasonable, in the manner of abandoned properties whose owners are glad to have anyone in them. Jacob came down from the mountain the following Saturday, not a Thursday, which was itself a change, the beginning of the departure from the established pattern toward something less structured and therefore more permanent, and looked at the building with Elena and Grace. It was larger than the workshop, with a back room that had a proper hearth and ceiling height that would accommodate a saw bench. The front room had 2 windows and rough board floors and smelled of old sawdust and something mineral she couldn't identify. Previous tenant was a farrier, Elena said. Jacob looked at the ceiling. He looked at the back room. He looked at the windows. He walked the length of it, pressing his foot to the floor every few yards the way you did with floors in old buildings to test for soft spots. Grace was running her hand along the back wall. "The wood here is good," she said. "Dry. Old growth, probably. The rings are tight." She turned her head. "He should take it." Jacob, who had been watching her peripherally, looked at Elena. He pointed at Grace with a questioning look. "What did she say?" Elena wrote it. He read it and looked at Grace, who had her hand still on the wall with the assessing expression she wore when she was being accurate. He wrote in the ledger, "Tell her she knows wood grain." Elena read it to Grace. Grace nodded as though this were an obvious confirmation of something she already knew. "I've been learning from the carving samples you leave," Grace said. "I can tell pine from cedar now by the resin smell and the grain texture. Oak is different from both, and walnut is completely different from anything else." Jacob read it and wrote, "Walnut is the best." Grace nodded again. "I know," she said. "The drumhead frame is walnut. It resonates longer." He looked at Elena. Elena looked at him. He signed the papers with Hobbs the following week. He didn't move down from the mountain all at once. That was not the kind of change he made, and Elena had learned not to expect it. He came to the building, his building. She had started thinking of it that way without deciding to. Most Saturdays and some Wednesdays, bringing tools down gradually, setting up the bench, working on the floor's bad spots before he brought in the saw bench, because the floor needed to be right before you put weight on it in one concentrated place. Grace went with Elena on Saturdays when there were no customers, and she and Jacob had developed by now a communication that didn't require Elena as intermediary, a system of specific touches and surfaces and rhythms that was half the raised dot alphabet and half something they'd invented themselves, which Elena observed with a kind of bemused wonder and a total inability to fully follow it. "He's going to make shelves," Grace reported one Saturday on the walk back to the workshop. "Along the whole east wall. He showed me the plan. He drew it in raised lines so I could feel it." "He drew you a plan," Elena said. "An architectural drawing, to scale. He measured twice." Grace said this with the approval of someone for whom measuring twice was a fundamental moral position. "He said the shelves are for inventory, but he drew in a low section on the left end with a different edge profile, and when I felt it I told him it was the same height as the drum stand. And he didn't write anything back, he just put my hand on the relevant section of the drawing again." Elena looked at her daughter. "He's building you a section." "He's building me a workspace," Grace corrected. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" Grace thought about it. "A section is an afterthought. A workspace is a plan." Elena was quiet for a moment, walking. The main road of Timber Ridge was its usual mid-afternoon self. Horses, a delivery wagon, two women from the north side who nodded as they passed. She had walked this road every day for 4 months, and it had gone from foreign to familiar in the way places do when you've looked at them enough times to stop seeing them and start simply knowing them. "Grace," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy here?" It was a direct question of the kind she didn't always ask, because Grace handled direct questions with a literalness that sometimes produced answers Elena wasn't ready for. But she asked it because she needed to know, not to confirm what she hoped, but to actually know. Grace walked for a few steps. She was thinking, which she did visibly, in the slight forward set of her shoulders and the particular quiet she went into when she was being genuinely careful with something. "Happy is a complicated word," Grace said. "It means a lot of different things depending on who's using it." "I know. What does it mean for you?" Another pause. "I have the drum. I have the book and the letter system. I have a workspace being built in a building that smells like good wood." She paused. "I have you. And I have Jacob, who doesn't talk around me or about me. He just talks to me, or writes to me, or shows me things." She stopped walking for a moment, which she rarely did without a physical reason. "When we were in Pittsburgh, I always felt like I was beside the world, like it was happening next to me and I could feel the edges of it, but I wasn't in it. And now? Now I'm in it," Grace said simply. Elena looked at her daughter's profile. The serious face, the forward tilt of the head, the particular quality of presence that Grace had always had, and that it had taken Elena longer than she was proud of to understand, was not diminished by the blindness, but was, in some sense she couldn't fully articulate, deepened by it. Grace paid attention the way you paid attention when you couldn't afford to be careless about information, and that attention had made her, over 9 years, into someone who was more in the world than most sighted people Elena had known. "Yes," Elena said. "You are." They walked the rest of the way in the easy quiet they'd always had between them, the silence of two people who knew each other well enough to not fill space for its own sake. The mountain was bright above the ridge, the summer light long and clear, and somewhere behind them the sound of Jacob's hammer carried down from the building 2 lots away, steady and deliberate. Measuring twice, getting it right. That evening, Elena sat at the cutting table after Grace was asleep upstairs at Marta's and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, not to anyone at all, really. It was the kind of writing she did sometimes to find out what she thought, the way some people spoke aloud to themselves in empty rooms. She wrote, "I came here with $2.40 and no plan and a child that a man called defective on a public platform." She wrote, "I am still here. The man is not." She wrote, "I do not know exactly what comes next. That used to frighten me more than it does now." She wrote, "Grace says she is in the world. I think I am too." She looked at what she'd written. Then she folded the paper and put it in the small box she kept at the back of the cutting table drawer, where she kept the things she needed to have somewhere even if they weren't for anyone. She turned off the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark of the workshop, listening to the mountains settle around the town, the way mountains settled all night while people slept, the tiny shifts and size of rock finding its new balance, working out where it wanted to be. She thought, the next thing. And then she thought, no, not tonight. Tonight she just sat in the dark and let the mountain be the mountain, and that was enough. The summer turned without ceremony. July came in hot and dry, the kind of mountain summer that burned the moisture out of the air and left everything sharp-edged and clear. And Elena's workshop filled and emptied and filled again with the steady rhythm of a business that had found its footing. She had 3 regular accounts now: the mine management families, the Northside households, and a small but consistent stream of individual customers who came for alterations and left with the word-of-mouth recommendation that was the only advertising she'd ever been able to afford or had ever needed. She hired a girl on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 15 years old, the daughter of one of the independent miners, with quick hands and the willingness to learn that was more valuable than any prior skill. Her name was Ada, and she had the particular quality of young people who understand early that watching carefully is faster than being told, and within 3 weeks she could run basic hems on the treadle machine without supervision while Elena handled the complex work. Grace taught Ada the thread system. This was not something Elena had asked for. Grace simply observed Ada's confusion at the thread rack on her second day and sat down with her and explained the notch and knot method she'd developed, demonstrating with her fingers. Ada learned it in 20 minutes, and thereafter organized the thread with a consistency that Elena had never quite managed herself. "She understands systems," Grace said, after Ada had gone home that Thursday. "She's going to be good," Elena agreed. "She already is," Grace said. "She just doesn't know it yet." Elena looked at her daughter, 9 years old and 2 months, serious in the corner chair with her letter book open on her lap. She'd finished Stories from the Prairie in 6 weeks, and Jacob had ordered 3 more volumes from Denver, and she was working through them with the methodical hunger of someone who has been thirsty for a long time and has finally found water. She said things like she just doesn't know it yet with the calm authority of someone reporting observable facts, and Elena had long since stopped being surprised by it and had simply incorporated it into the texture of daily life, the way you incorporate weather. What she thought, looking at her daughter in that moment, was this: Thomas Brennan called her defective on a public platform, and she sat in the dust of the mine yard and kept 3 terrified children calm for 2 hours. And she taught a 15-year-old an organizational system that improved the efficiency of a working business. And she is 9 years old, and she already knows more about people than most adults will figure out before they die. She didn't say any of that. She went back to the writing code on the table and kept working. Well, Jacob proposed in August, in the way that Jacob did things, without performance, without the conventional staging that the occasion was supposed to require. He was at the cutting table on a Thursday with the ledger between them, and they had been talking about the building. The shelves were finished, the saw bench was installed, and he'd taken his first commission from a family on the south side who needed a dining table. And then there was a pause in the writing, the kind of pause that is not empty but full, the kind she'd learned to read over months of conversation conducted in this slower medium. He wrote, I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it correctly, so I'm going to write it out before I say it. She waited. He wrote, I know I am not what you came here expecting. I know I am a man who lives on a mountain and communicates in writing and has a history that belongs to him and won't ever fully belong to anyone else. He paused. I know you had a husband you loved, and that loving me is not replacing him and doesn't need to be. She kept her eyes on the ledger. He wrote, I also know that this, what we've been doing for 7 months, is the first time since Daniel and Catherine that I have felt like the world contained me rather than just surrounded me. He stopped, read what he'd written, kept it. Grace said once that she is in the world now. I felt that too when she said it. I don't want to go back to the other thing. He wrote, Will you marry me? I wrote it without a question mark because it doesn't feel like a question. It feels like the thing I already know I want, but I want you to choose it too, not just receive it. Elena read this 3 times. She sat with it the way she sat with complex repairs, fully, without rushing toward the conclusion before she'd understood the whole of it. Then she picked up the pencil. She wrote, You should know that I am stubborn and bad at asking for help. And I work too many hours, and sometimes I sit in the dark after Grace is asleep and write things that are not for anyone because it is the only way I know how to think. She wrote, I am not the woman I was when I came here. I am not sure I am easier to live with than I was then. I am not sure I was ever easy to live with. She wrote, I also know that what you built for Grace, the board, the drum, the workspace, the books from Denver, all of it, was the first time in 9 years that someone looked at my daughter and saw what she needed rather than what she lacked. She stopped. That is not a small thing. That is not a thing I can be neutral about. She wrote, Yes. He read it. He looked at the word for a moment. Then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were 2 imperfect people sitting at a cutting table in a small workshop in a mountain town, and the moment was not cinematic and not grand and was entirely sufficiently real. What did he write? Grace asked from the corner. He asked me to marry him, Elena said. I know, Grace said. What did you write back? Yes. Grace turned a page in her book. Good, she said. That was the right answer. She paused. I would have told you if it wasn't. They were married in October, in the small ceremony that suited 2 people who were both constitutionally averse to being the center of public attention. Marta's parlor, which was the nicest indoor space available, with Robert and Nora Finch as witnesses, and Carl from room 6 and Hobbs and Ada's family, and 6 other people who had earned the right to be there through the specific currency of having shown up in the difficult months. Grace stood beside Elena in a new dress that Elena had made herself. Deep blue wool, fitted at the shoulders the way Grace's dresses needed to be fitted so the weight sat right and didn't shift when she moved. She held the drum mallet in her left hand. Nobody had asked her to bring it. She had decided it belonged there, and she was not wrong. Jacob wore a clean coat and his good boots, and his hair had finally been cut, which changed his face in a way Elena had been quietly curious about for months. He was handsome in the particular way of men who are not thinking about being handsome, which was the best kind. The ceremony was short. The words were the functional ones, the commitment, the witness, the record. What Elena remembered afterward was not the words, but the moment just after, when Jacob turned to Grace and crouched down to her level and held out his hands palm up, and Grace put her hands in his and stood still for a moment. She tapped a short pattern on his palm with 2 fingers. He felt it. He looked at Elena, who couldn't fully interpret what Grace had tapped. Grace said, I told him welcome to the family, in the rhythm system. Jacob looked back at Grace and tapped something back on her hands. 3 short, 1 long. Grace smiled, fully, openly, the rare, complete smile that she reserved for things she'd assessed as genuinely worth it. He said he's been in it for a while already, she said. Elena looked at her husband, who was still crouched at Grace's level, his eyes slightly bright in a way that he would have been mortified to have anyone mention. She decided not to mention it. The first years were not seamless. Nothing real ever is, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something or remembering wrong. Jacob and Elena argued, sometimes seriously, about the things that people who are both stubborn and self-sufficient argue about. Who carried which weight, when to ask for help, how much silence was companionable, and how much was avoidance. Jacob had spent years alone on a mountain and had habits that were not designed for shared life. He forgot that his whereabouts mattered to someone now. He worked in the building until late and came home after Grace was asleep, and sometimes after Elena was too, and she found this intolerable in the way of someone who had learned to track another person's safety as a survival practice and could not simply stop. She told him this in the ledger, in the direct way she'd learned was the only way that worked with him. When you don't come home at the time, you said, I don't know if something has happened to you on the trail. I know you have been on that trail for years without anyone to tell. But I am someone to tell now. He read it and sat with it, and she could see him doing the thing he did when something had landed accurately and he was deciding what to do with it. He wrote, I didn't think about it that way. I will think about it that way. And then he did, imperfectly and with occasional lapses, but genuinely, which was all she'd asked. Elena, for her part, found that years of total self-sufficiency had made her poor at receiving. Jacob would see something that needed doing, a supply run, a repair in the workshop, the shimmied table leg finally properly fixed rather than shimmied, and simply do it. And she would come in and find it done and feel, irrationally, a flash of something that was not quite irritation but was adjacent to it. The reaction of someone whose competence is their primary security and who is not yet fully comfortable with the idea that someone helping is not the same as someone doubting. She knew this about herself. Knowing it didn't immediately fix it. It took time and several frank conversations in the ledger, and Jacob's particular brand of patience, which was not the patient patience of someone who had decided to tolerate her, but the patient patience of someone who genuinely thought she was worth the time. Grace navigated their adjustment with the equanimity of someone who had always processed the world differently and found most adult complications less surprising than adults found them. She observed and occasionally commented when directly asked, and otherwise continued being Grace, in the world now, fully, reading her raised dot books, and playing the drum, and teaching Ada new thread systems, and occasionally announcing things about people that she had worked out from information the people themselves didn't know they were broadcasting. The learning room came from Grace. She was 10 when she proposed it, in the way she proposed most things. Not as a request, but as a logical next step that she had worked out and was presenting for confirmation. She and Jacob were in the building one Saturday, and Elena was there too, working on a commission at the portable table she'd set up near the front window. And Grace was at her workspace on the low-shelved section of the east wall, and she said, without preamble, "There should be a room where children like me can learn." Jacob was at the saw bench. He couldn't hear her, but he felt the change in her posture. She had a way of standing differently when she was saying something important. And he put down his plane and looked at Elena. Elena relayed it in writing. Jacob read it and sat down on his workbench stool. Grace continued. The school in Pittsburgh was underfunded and overcrowded. Miss Adler told me that. There are children in this territory who are blind or deaf or who learn differently, and most of them have nothing. No raised dot books, no drum systems, no workspace built to the right height. She turned her head toward Jacob's general direction in the way she did when she was addressing him. You know how to build things. Mama knows how to teach people. You have the building. Jacob wrote, The building is for the carpentry business. Elena read it to Grace. Grace said, The front room isn't. The front room has the 2 windows and the good floor, and you don't use it for anything except storage. Jacob looked at Elena. Elena looked at him. She thought about Miss Adler saying she needs room. She thought about Grace in the mine yard with the 3 frightened children, talking them calm. Jacob wrote, It would need supplies, books, the right tools. Grace said, I know where to order the books. I've had 4 of them now. I know the Denver supplier. Jacob wrote, It would need a teacher. Elena said, out loud without writing it, because she was saying it to herself as much as to anyone, Grace, when you're old enough. Grace turned toward her mother's voice. The expression on her face was the one Elena knew best of all Grace's expressions. Not the public one, not the assessing one, not the careful one she wore with strangers. The private one, the one that was only available when she was not managing anyone's reaction to her, the one that was simply and completely her, focused, present, already 3 steps ahead. Yes, Grace said, when I'm old enough. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen without difficulty. The front room became a learning room by degree. First one child, the deaf son of a family from the Eastern Valley, who came to Jacob because Jacob was the only person they knew who understood what their son needed. Then 2 more children in the spring, one blind and one with a slowness of learning that had been called stupidity by everyone who didn't know the difference, and which Grace, within 2 weeks of meeting him, identified as something else entirely, something that needed different entry points rather than repeated use of the same failed ones. Jacob built the furniture. Elena sourced the books and the tools and the raised dot supplies from Denver, and then from a printer in Chicago, she found through a catalog that a woman in Nora Finch's reading circle happened to have. Nora donated money without being asked. Robert Finch wrote a letter to the Denver School Board, which produced nothing immediately but established a record. Carl, who was retired from mining by the second year and had time and 2 functional hands and apparently a latent gift for patience with children that nobody, including Carl, had previously suspected, came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays and was in charge of nothing specific and useful for almost everything. The town of Timber Ridge did not transform overnight into a place of enlightenment and perfect acceptance. That is not how towns or people work. There were still people who crossed to the other side of the street when they saw Grace coming, people who spoke to Elena about Grace in the tone that meant, "Isn't it a shame?" and didn't understand why Elena's expression closed when they did. There were days when the learning room had 3 children in it, and days when it had none, when families decided the distance was too far, or the strangeness was too much, or grandmother had an opinion that carried the week. But there were also days when it had 6. There was the Tuesday when the deaf boy, his name was Thomas, which Grace had noted with a brief private irony, played the drum for the first time, and his face did the thing that faces do when something lands in the right place. There was the afternoon when the slow-learning boy read aloud from a simple book in the system Grace had developed for him, a system that was not in any manual and had no formal name. And the word he read was home, and he said it out loud and looked up as though checking whether the room was still there. Elena was in the doorway when that happened. She had been bringing supplies from the workshop. She stood in the doorway with the supplies in her arms and watched, and did not go in for a moment because she didn't want to change the quality of the air in the room. Jacob came up behind her. He put a hand on her shoulder, briefly, the way he was with touch, never excessive, always deliberate. And she reached up and put her hand over his without turning around, and they stood in the doorway together and watched the boy say the word again to himself, quietly, like he was keeping it. There is something worth saying here, something that this story has been building toward without announcing it, something about what it means to be told you are not enough, and to survive that telling and to go on. Thomas Brennan called Grace defective on a public platform because Grace's blindness was, to him, a deficit that reduced her value as a person. He was not the last person to think this, and he was not the worst person to have thought it, but he was the specific person who said it to Elena on the first day of her new life, in a place where she had nowhere to go, and what she carried out of that moment, the things she took with her when she walked off the platform, was not defeat and not despair. It was the cold, functional clarity of someone who has been told a lie and knows it, and who has decided that the best response to a lie is to build something true. What Elena built was a business. What Jacob built was furniture and a learning room and a place where broken things were made useful again rather than discarded. What Grace built was harder to describe, because what Grace built was method, the gradual, careful accumulation of ways in. Ways into music, ways into language, ways into rooms and conversations, and the world itself. And then she handed those ways to other children who needed them, which is the truest possible use of anything you've had to fight to find. The train platform in Timber Ridge still stood, 14 years after Elena arrived at it. The boards had been replaced twice. The station master was a different man. The mountain above the valley was the same mountain, doing what mountains do, shifting, settling, adjusting its weight in the dark while people slept below it, never still even when it appeared to be. Elena came to the platform one October morning, the October that Grace turned 23, 2 years after she'd formally taken over the learning room and 3 years after she'd written to the Denver School Board herself in raised dot script transcribed by a sympathetic clerk, requesting formal recognition of the program. The recognition had come through in June. It was not everything, but it was something that could be built from. She was not waiting for a train. She was walking. She walked most mornings. The circuit through town that kept her legs good and kept her in contact with the texture of the place she had made her home. She stopped at the platform because she stopped there sometimes, not out of sentimentality exactly, but out of the habit of checking in with the past to confirm that the present was still true. She stood on the boards and looked at the valley. Behind her, the workshop was open. Ada ran it now, 3 days a week, and had hired her own girl. Jacob's building was full of commissions. The dining table he'd made for the Southside family had led to 6 more, and then to a reputation that had reached as far as Denver, and there were now more orders than his hands could keep pace with, which was a problem he had no complaints about. Grace was at the learning room. She was there most mornings, earlier than she needed to be, in the particular way of people who have found the work that fits them and don't feel the friction of it, the same way they feel other effort. Elena stood on the platform and thought about the woman who had stood here 14 years ago with $2.40 and a blind child and the ruins of a plan, and she did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt something more complicated than sorry, something that was not quite pride and not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but contained all three. The feeling of someone who has come far enough to see where she started and understands, only from this distance, how far she has walked. The morning light was long on the mountain. Somewhere down the road she could hear the faint sound of the drum. Grace, warming up, the rhythm of it carrying through the clear October air, the way it always did, steady and unhurried, feeling the world through her hands. Elena listened. Then she turned off the platform and walked home.